The wind did not blow across the high plains so much as it scoured them. It was a relentless, invisible grit that sought out every seam in a coat and every pore in the skin. Jonah Cole rode with his head bowed against it, the brim of his hat pulled low to shield eyes that were already red-rimmed from the alkali dust. His horse, a large roan with a coat the color of dried blood, plodded forward with the heavy resignation of an animal that had forgotten what a lush pasture looked or smelled like. Around them, the land was a study in desolation. It was late afternoon, and the sun was a white blister in a sky bleached of all color. The sagebrush that dotted the hardpan earth looked brittle, gray skeletons clinging to soil that offered no nourishment. To the west, jagged formations of rock rose up like the spine of some buried leviathan, casting long, sharp shadows that stretched toward the lone rider. Jonah shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking in the silence. He had been riding for 3 weeks, drifting north and west, following a whisper of a trail that grew colder and hotter by turns. He was a man of 30 years, though the sun in the rough country had etched lines around his mouth and eyes that belonged to a man a decade older. He wore a canvas duster that had once been tan, but was now the color of the road, and beneath it, a revolver sat high on his hip, the walnut grip worn smooth by the friction of his palm. The trail dipped into a shallow wash and climbed out onto a ridge that overlooked a sweep of valley floor. There, standing stark against the emptiness, was a ruin. It had been a homestead once. Jonah pulled the roan to a halt. The horse blew air through its nostrils, shifting its weight. But Jonah sat frozen. The structure was little more than a blackened skeleton now. Charred timbers jutted up from the stone foundation like broken ribs. The roof had collapsed inward, and the wind whistled through the gaps where windows had once held glass. Jonah nudged the horse forward, drawn to the wreckage against his will. As he drew closer, the smell hit him. Even after months or years, the scent of fire never truly left wood. It was a sharp, acrid ghost that hung in the air. He saw a warped iron stove lying on its side in the rubble, its metal door hanging open like a screaming mouth. A rusted skillet lay half buried in the dirt nearby. The sight of it tore a hole in the careful numbness Jonah had built around himself. Suddenly, he was not in this valley. He was back in Kansas, standing in the dark, watching orange flames lick the night sky. He could hear the roar of the fire, a sound like a freight train, consuming the timber of his own home. He could hear the shouting. He could hear the silence that came after. The memory was a physical blow. His hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles turned white. The leather bit into his gloves. He could see the face of the man who had given the order. He could see Silas Maddox sitting on a high-stepping gray horse, watching the destruction with the dispassionate interest of a man watching a weed being pulled from a garden. Maddox. Jonah forced his jaw to unclench. He breathed in the dry, dusty air, forcing the memory back down into the dark cellar of his mind where he kept the things that threatened to break him. Maddox? He whispered. The name sounded like a curse. It tasted like ash on his tongue. He spurred the roan forward, turning his eyes away from the ruined house. He could not afford to stop. He could not afford to grieve. Not yet. The town of Lantern Creek appeared an hour later, a smudge on the horizon that slowly resolved into a collection of geometric shapes. It sat on the edge of the territory, pinned between the mouth of a box canyon and the sprawling emptiness of the desert. It was a place that looked as if it had been built by accident and regretted ever since. As Jonah rode down the main thoroughfare, the town revealed its scars. The buildings were timber and adobe, crooked and beaten by the weather. The paint, if there ever had been any, had long since peeled away to leave bare gray wood. A rail line sliced past the northern edge of the town, the steel tracks shimmering in the heat, a lifeline that connected this purgatory to the civilized world. Though the connection felt tenuous at best, people moved through the street with their heads down. A woman carrying a basket of laundry hurried across the dirt road, her eyes fixed on her boots. 2 men leaning against the wall of the general store stopped talking as Jonah passed, watching him with the flat, wary gaze of dogs that had been kicked too many times. They did not look at him with curiosity. They looked at him with calculation, measuring whether he was a threat or a victim. Jonah kept his face impassive. He knew this look. It was the look of a town that was holding its breath. He found the livery stable at the far end of the street, a sprawling barn that smelled of sweet hay and manure. A young man was pitching straw in one of the stalls. He looked up as Jonah rode in, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. He couldn't have been more than 20, with a face that was still soft despite the grime. "Afternoon," the boy said. Jonah dismounted, his boots hitting the packed earth with a heavy thud. He patted the roan's neck. "Needs grain and a rub-down," Jonah said. His voice was raspy from the dust. "And check the left hind shoe. Feels like it is working loose." The boy nodded, taking the reins. He ran a hand over the horse's flank, his touch gentle. "Fine animal. You rode him hard. He can take it," Jonah said. The boy began to unsaddle the horse, his movements efficient. "I am Tom Avery. Jonah Cole." Tom paused, glancing at Jonah over the saddle. "You looking for work, Mr. Cole? Or just passing through?" "Little of both. Maybe," Jonah said. Tom hesitated. He looked toward the open doors of the barn, scanning the street before lowering his voice. "If you are looking for work, the rail yard is hiring. It is hard labor and the pay is poor, but it is money. Just do not go looking for work with the association." "The association?" Jonah asked, though he knew the answer. "The Cattlemen's Association," Tom said. He spat into the straw. "That is what they call it, but it is just one man, Silas Maddox." Jonah felt the name ripple through him, but his face remained like stone. "Is that so?" Tom moved closer, dropping his voice to a whisper. "He owns this town. Mr. Cole. He owns it without owning a thing on paper. He has got men who ride for him, and they do not care much for strangers. If you want to stay healthy, you steer clear of Maddox and his brand." Jonah looked at the boy. He saw fear in Tom's eyes, but he also saw a spark of decency. The boy was warning him because it was the right thing to do. "I will keep that in mind," Jonah said. He turned and walked out of the livery, leaving the boy to his work. The sun was beginning to dip toward the mountains, casting the town in a bruised, purple light. Jonah adjusted his gun belt and headed for the largest building on the street. A weathered sign above the door read simply, "Saloon." He pushed through the bat-wing doors. The air inside was thick enough to chew. It smelled of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and unwashed bodies. A haze of blue smoke hung below the ceiling, swirling in the draft from the door. The floor was covered in sawdust that had long ago turned gray with filth. Jonah moved to the bar, his spurs chiming softly. He felt the eyes of the room shift to him and then away. Men stood in clusters, boots hooked on the brass rail, glasses of whiskey in their hands. They were railroad workers, drifters, and a few cowboys with dust thick on their coats. At the back of the room, a piano player hammered out a tinny, discordant tune. Jonah ordered a whiskey. The barkeep, a man with a scarred nose and no patience, slid a dirty glass across the wood and poured a measure of amber liquid that smelled like turpentine. Jonah took a drink. It burned going down, a clean, hot fire that settled in his gut. He turned his back to the bar, leaning his elbows on the wood, and scanned the room. He was not looking for anyone in particular, yet he was looking for everyone. He watched the reflection in the cracked mirror behind the bar. He watched the hands of the men playing poker at a round table. He watched the door. Then the piano stopped. The silence that followed was heavy. A woman stepped onto the small, raised platform in the corner of the room. She was dressed in a simple gown of dark red fabric that had seen better days, the lace at the cuffs slightly frayed. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face, revealing high cheekbones and eyes that were large and dark and infinitely tired. She did not smile. She did not flirt with the crowd. She simply signaled the piano player with a nod and began to sing. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring of the room like a blade. It was a low, smoky contralto, rough around the edges but controlled, She sang a ballad about a lost love and a river that ran wide and deep. It was a song of sorrow, and she sang it as if she knew every word personally. Jonah found himself staring. She was beautiful, yes, with a heritage that spoke of both Mexico and the Anglo-North. But it was not her beauty that held him. It was her dignity. Standing there in a room full of rough men, surrounded by the smell of vice and desperation, she held herself with a rigid, untouchable grace. She was the only clean thing in the entire town. Elena Vargas finished the verse and let the last note hang in the air. For a moment, the saloon was silent. Then a few men clapped, the sound scattered and indifferent. Elena did not seem to care. She stepped off the stage and moved toward a small table near the wall. Keeping her eyes down, she felt a gaze on her. She was used to it. Men looked at her constantly. They looked at her mouth, her hips, the curve of her neck. They looked at her with hunger and with contempt, often at the same time. To the respectable women of Lantern Creek, she was a stain, a woman who sang in a saloon for whiskey money. To the men, she was a challenge or a prize. She glanced up, bracing herself for a leering smile or a drunken wink. Instead, she met the eyes of the stranger at the bar. He was tall, lean, and covered in the dust of the trail. He was not looking at her body. He was looking at her face. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent. He wasn't stripping her with his gaze. He was studying her, the way a man might study a storm cloud on the horizon. Elena felt a prickle of unease. This man was different. The dangerous ones were always the quiet ones. She looked away, breaking the contact, and made a point of smoothing her skirt, focusing on the wood of the table. She knew how trouble started. It started with a new set of boots and a hungry stare. She would give him nothing. The batwing doors swung open with a violent crash. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was as if the air pressure had dropped. The low hum of conversation died out. The poker game paused. 3 men walked in. They wore long dusters and hats with wide brims. They moved with the arrogant, rolling gait of men who knew they could do whatever they pleased without consequence. They were Maddox's riders. The leader was a man named Blake. He was thick-bodied, with a face that looked like it had been mashed together from wet clay. A scar ran through his left eyebrow, and his eyes were small and cruel. He looked around the room, a sneer curling his lip. "Well now," Blake said, his voice loud and grating. "It smells like a pigsty in here." No one spoke. The barkeep nervously wiped a glass. Blake walked to the bar, his spurs jingling. He shoved a railroad worker out of his way without looking at him. The worker stumbled, but said nothing, staring at the floor. "Whiskey," Blake demanded. "The good stuff, not the swill you serve the dirt farmers." He tossed a coin onto the bar. It spun and settled. His 2 companions laughed, leaning against the bar and surveying the room with predatory grins. Blake turned, glass in hand, and his eyes landed on Elena. His grin widened. "Well, look at this. The little bird is out of her cage." Elena stiffened but did not look up. She kept her hands folded on the table. Blake walked over to her. He stood too close, his shadow falling over her. "Sing us a song, bird," he said. "Something happy. I am tired of that funeral music you wail. I am on my break." "Blake," Elena said. Her voice was steady. But Jonah, watching from the bar, saw the tension in her shoulders. "Break is over," Blake said. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. Elena tried to pull back, but his grip was iron. "Let go of me," she hissed. "Come on," Blake laughed, pulling her up from the chair. "Don't be shy. Sing for your supper. Or maybe you want to earn your keep another way." The room was paralyzed. Men looked into their drinks. The piano player stared at his keys. This was the law of Lantern Creek. What Maddox's men wanted, they took. Jonah set his glass down on the bar. The sound was soft, a small click of glass on wood, but it seemed to echo. He turned. He did not rush. He walked across the floor with a calm, measured stride. He stopped 6 feet from Blake. "Let her go," Jonah said. His voice was not loud. It was a low, flat rumble. Blake froze. He turned his head slowly, looking Jonah up and down with amusement. He did not release Elena's wrist. "And who might you be?" Blake asked. "Another dirt scrabbler passing through?" "Doesn't matter who I am," Jonah said. "Let the lady go." Blake laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He looked at his two companions. "You hear this? We got a hero." The other two men stepped away from the bar, their hands drifting toward the guns on their hips. The room held its breath. Blake looked back at Jonah, his smile vanishing. "Get lost, drifter. Before I decide to paint the floor with you." Jonah did not blink. He stood with his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, his arms hanging loose at his sides. His right hand was inches from the worn walnut grip of his revolver. He did not posture. He simply existed in the space, a coiled spring waiting to snap. "I will not ask you again," Jonah said. The silence stretched thin, vibrating with violence. Blake's eyes flickered. He saw something in Jonah's face that gave him pause, a lack of fear that was unnatural. Blake's hand hovered near his holster. His fingers twitched. Suddenly, the saloon door swung open again. "That is enough." The voice was a whip crack. Sheriff Elias Ward stepped into the room. He was an older man, gray-haired and lean, wearing a tin star pinned to a vest that had seen 20 years of wear. He held a double-barreled shotgun in the crook of his arm. It wasn't pointed at anyone, but its presence was argument enough. Sheriff Ward walked into the center of the standoff. He looked from Blake to Jonah, his eyes hard and weary. "Blake, let her go," Ward said. Blake sneered, but he released Elena's wrist. She stumbled back, rubbing the red marks on her skin, her dark eyes flashing with fury. "Just having some fun, Sheriff," Blake said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "New man here does not have a sense of humor. I know your kind of fun," Ward said. "Take your drink and get out. I do not want any trouble tonight." Blake stared at the sheriff, then turned his gaze back to Jonah. He spat on the floor near Jonah's boots. "We will see you around, hero," Blake said softly. He turned and swaggered out, his men following him. The batwing door swung shut, chopping the air. The tension in the room broke. Conversation started up again, hurried and whispered. Elena looked at Jonah. Her chest was heaving slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it. She gave him a short, sharp nod, not quite thanks, but an acknowledgement, and turned, disappearing through a door at the back of the room. Sheriff Ward looked at Jonah. He didn't smile. "Outside," the sheriff said. Jonah followed him out onto the boardwalk. The night air was cooling rapidly. The sky was a vast, dark ocean of stars, indifferent to the squabbles of men. Ward leaned against a support post, shifting the shotgun. He studied Jonah for a long moment. "You have got a name?" Ward asked. "Jonah Cole." "Well, Mr. Cole," Ward said. "You have been in town less than 3 hours, and you have already nearly drawn on Silas Maddox's foreman. That is a record." He put his hands on her. Jonah said, "I saw," Ward said, "and I stopped it. This town is barely alive as it is. Son, we are hanging by a thread. I do not need blood on the floor of the saloon. It attracts flies, and it attracts more trouble." Ward took a pouch of tobacco from his pocket and began to roll a cigarette with practiced, trembling fingers. "What are you doing in Lantern Creek?" "Looking for work," Jonah said. Ward lit the cigarette, and the flare of the match illuminated his face. It was a map of regrets, deep lines cut from nose to chin. "Work," Ward repeated. He blew a stream of smoke into the night. "You do not look like a man looking for work. You look like a man hunting." Jonah said nothing. He watched the street. Ward sighed. "Listen to me. I know the look. I have seen it on 100 faces. You are carrying something heavy. Grief, anger. Maybe a debt you think can be paid in lead." The sheriff pushed off the post and stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You will never find peace out here," Ward said. "Not with what you are carrying. This land. It takes everything and gives nothing back. If you are here for revenge, turn around and ride out." Jonah looked at the sheriff. He saw a man who knew the difference between justice and survival, and who had chosen survival so many times that he had forgotten what justice looked like. Jonah's voice was quiet, barely louder than the wind. "Peace ain't what I am after." The sheriff's face hardened. The sadness in his eyes deepened. A profound, exhausted weight. He nodded slowly. "I was afraid you would say that." Ward turned and walked away down the boardwalk, his boots echoing in the darkness. He knew he couldn't stop what was coming. He could only try to keep the town from drowning when the dam finally broke. Jonah stood alone for a moment, then turned toward the edge of town. He needed a place to sleep. The boarding house was a 2-story structure near the edge of the settlement, where the buildings gave way to scrub and rock. It was painted appealing white, with a porch that wrapped around the front. A sign swinging in the wind read, "Vargas Boarding." Jonah walked up the steps. The wood groaned under his weight. He knocked on the door. It opened a moment later. Eliana stood there. She had changed out of her red dress into a simple cotton wrapper, wrapped tight against the chill. She held a kerosene lamp, the light casting her face in gold and shadow. She looked at him, and her eyes widened slightly. "You," she said, "I need a room." Jonah said, "If you have one." Elena hesitated. She blocked the doorway with her body. She looked past him into the dark street, checking for others. "I run a respectable house. Mr. Cole," she said. Her voice was blunt, stripping away the vulnerability he had seen in the saloon. "I pay on time," Jonah said. "I am quiet. $2 a week, in advance," she said. "No drinking in the rooms, no loud noise, and you do not bring drunk men to my door. I have a brother here, and decent people trying to sleep." "I understand," Jonah said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 silver dollars. He held them out. Elena looked at the coins, then up at his face. For a second, the transaction hung suspended. She saw the dust on his coat, the exhaustion in his posture, and the strange, terrifying calm that lay beneath it. She remembered him standing between her and Blake. She remembered that he hadn't touched her, hadn't asked for anything. She took the money. Her fingers brushed his palm. His skin was rough, calloused. Her hand was cool. A current seemed to jump between them, a recognition of shared hardness. "Room 3, top of the stairs," she said, stepping back. "Breakfast is at 6. Do not be late." "Thank you, ma'am," Jonah said. He stepped inside, the floorboards creaking. The house smelled of lavender and beeswax, a sharp contrast to the saloon. It smelled like a home. That evening, after stowing his saddlebags in the small, spare room, Jonah went back out to the porch. He leaned against the railing, rolling a cigarette but not lighting it. The wind had died down. The town was quiet, far out on the plains. A coyote howled, a lonely, wavering sound that rose and fell. Another answered it from the canyon. Jonah looked out at the darkness. He was here. He was in the same town as Silas Maddox. The man who had burned his world was within reach. The rage was there, sitting in his chest like a cold stone. But as he stood there, he heard a sound from inside the house. It was footsteps, steady, rhythmic footsteps. He could hear Elena moving about in the kitchen, perhaps preparing for the morning. He heard the clink of a dish, the soft shut of a cupboard. It was the sound of life, the sound of someone building a day, surviving, enduring. Jonah closed his eyes. He felt a strange, unwelcome pull in his chest. It was an ache that had nothing to do with anger. It was a hunger for something he had told the sheriff he didn't want. It was a wish for a world where he could just stand on a porch and listen to a woman moving inside a house, without blood on his hands or ghosts at his back. He opened his eyes and stared at the dark horizon. He struck a match on the railing, the flame flaring bright and brief, illuminating his scarred face before he touched it to the tobacco. "Maddox," he whispered again. But this time, the name didn't completely fill the silence. The days in Lantern Creek did not pass so much as they ground forward, like a wagon wheel turning in deep mud. Jonah Cole settled into a rhythm that was defined by the ache in his muscles and the watchful silence he carried like a second gun. He took whatever work he could find, determined to keep his hands busy while his eyes dissected the town's anatomy. He spent 3 days fixing fences for a rancher named Old Man Miller, a man with hands twisted by arthritis and a face like a dried apple. The work was brutal. The sun beat down on the high plains until the air shimmered, and the dry rot in the fence posts crumbled under Jonah's hammer. As they worked, Miller spoke in fits and starts, his voice dropping whenever a rider appeared on the horizon. Jonah learned quickly that the silence in Lantern Creek was enforced. "Maddox controls the water rights on the South Ridge," Miller said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his neck with a rag that was gray with dust. "He controls the banknotes, too. You miss a payment, and you do not just lose your land. You lose your way out." Jonah drove a staple into the cedar post with a single, violent strike. "And the law?" he asked. Miller spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the parched earth. "Sheriff Ward is a good man who has been tired for 20 years. He knows which fights he can win. And against Silas Maddox, there ain't no winning. There is just surviving until he decides he wants what you have got." Jonah absorbed this, filing it away behind his stoic expression. He hauled supplies from the rail yard, lifting crates of machinery and sacks of flour until his back screamed. He saw the way the station master deferred to men wearing the distinctive M brand on their dusters. He saw how the shopkeepers hurried to serve Maddox's foreman, Blake, while other customers waited. The town was a body, and Maddox was the disease in its blood. But it was the boarding house where the hours felt heaviest, and yet, strangely, where time seemed to slow down. The house was small, the walls thin enough that privacy was a polite fiction. Jonah and Elena Vargas existed in a choreography of avoidance that slowly, day by day, began to erode. They crossed paths in the narrow hallway in the gray light of dawn. Jonah would be heading out, his hat pulled low, and Elena would be coming from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, the smell of wood smoke and strong coffee clinging to her hair. "Morning," Jonah would say, his voice rough with sleep. "Mr. Cole," she would reply, nodding once, her dark eyes guarded. They met at the wash basin in the evenings, waiting for the dust to settle from the water. They met in the cramped kitchen where the air was always thick with the scent of beans simmering on the stove. At first, the silence between them was sharp, edged with the wariness of two people who expected the worst from the world. But slowly, the edges softened. Jonah noticed the way she hummed when she thought she was alone. A melody that sounded like the one she sang in the saloon, but softer, without the performance in it. Elena noticed the way Jonah repaired the loose hinge on the front door without being asked, and how he left his muddy boots on the porch to spare her scrubbing the floor. One evening, as Jonah sat at the small kitchen table cleaning his revolver, Elena poured him a cup of coffee. She didn't ask if he wanted it. She just set the tin cup down near his elbow. "You handle that gun like it is part of your hand," she said, watching him reassemble the cylinder. "It has been with me a long time." Jonah said, "Does it ever get heavy?" "Every day," he answered, not looking up. She lingered for a moment, her hand resting on the back of a chair. "Most men in this town wear guns to feel big. You wear yours like a tool you wish you didn't need." Jonah paused, the oil rag stilled in his hand. He looked up at her. The kitchen light was dim, casting shadows that hollowed her cheeks but made her eyes shine. "Tools do a job, ma'am, that is all." She studied him, her expression unreadable, then turned back to the stove. "Just make sure the job is worth doing. Mr. Cole." It was in these quiet hours that Jonah began to notice the boy. Mateo, Elena's half-brother, was a wiry teenager of perhaps 16 winters, with skin the color of polished copper and hair that fell into his eyes. He was a ghost in the house, slipping in late at night and leaving before the sun was fully up. He moved with a defensive hunch, as if expecting a blow from every corner. Jonah found him one afternoon at the rail yard. The boy was laboring in a gang of men laying new ties on a spur line. The work was back-breaking, swinging a sledgehammer in the relentless heat. Mateo was smaller than the other men, but he worked with a frantic, desperate energy. The foreman was a bull of a man with a red face and a voice that carried over the clanging of steel. He walked the line, shouting orders, his gaze lingering on the immigrant workers and the few native laborers with distinct disdain. When the whistle blew for the end of the shift, the men lined up for their daily pay. Jonah, who had been unloading crates on the platform nearby, paused to watch. He saw the foreman counting out coins. When Mateo reached the front of the line, the foreman dropped a few coins into the boy's hand, far less than what the others had received. Mateo looked at the money, then up at the man. "This is half," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I worked the full shift." The foreman laughed, a dry, ugly sound. "You worked half as hard as a white man. Boy, you get half the pay. That is the rate for half-breed trouble in this town. Now move along before I dock you the rest for insolence." Mateo stood his ground, his fists clenching at his sides. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a humiliation that burned hot. Behind him, other workers shifted their feet, looking away. No one spoke. Jonah stepped off the platform. He did not run. He walked with that same terrifying, measured pace he had used in the saloon. The gravel crunched under his boots. The sound was loud in the sudden quiet. Jonah stopped beside Mateo. He towered over the boy, but his eyes were fixed on the foreman. The boy worked the full shift. Jonah said. The foreman squinted at him, shielding his eyes from the sun. "Who are you, the man who watched him drive spikes for 10 hours? Jonah said, "Pay him what he is owed." The foreman bristled, his hand drifting toward the knife on his belt. "This is none of your business, drifter. This is company policy. It is theft," Jonah said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He simply stated the fact as if it were a rock in the road. He took a step closer, invading the foreman's space. The foreman looked into Jonah's eyes and saw the scars of a life that had been far harder than anything found in a rail yard. He saw a violence that was currently leashed but very much awake. The foreman swallowed. He looked around, but his own men were suddenly very interested in their boots. With a sneer, he dug into his pocket and slapped 2 more silver dollars into Mateo's hand. "Take it," he spat, "and do not expect to find work here tomorrow." Jonah watched the man walk away. He turned to Mateo. The boy was staring at the coins in his dirty palm, his chest heaving. "Thank you," Mateo mumbled, not looking up. "Do not thank me," Jonah said quietly. "You earned it." He walked away before the boy could say more. But that evening, when Mateo came home, he looked at Jonah with a gaze that was less like a hunted animal and more like a man measuring another man. The saloon was where the truth of the town usually floated to the surface, buoyed by whiskey and looseness of tongue. A few nights later, Jonah sat at a corner table, nursing a beer that was more foam than liquid. The room was noisy, but Jonah was focused on a wall near the back, plastered with old notices, train schedules, and fading advertisements. Among them, framed in cheap wood that was gray with dust, was a newspaper clipping from a territorial gazette, dated 10 years prior. Next to it hung a wanted poster, the paper yellow and curling at the corners. Jonah stood and walked over to it, ignoring the glare of a card player whose chair he brushed. The headline on the clipping read, "Cattle Baron expands holdings in Bloody Range War." The article detailed the rise of Silas Maddox, describing him as a former trail boss turned hired gun who had carved out an empire through aggressive negotiation. The wanted poster was for a man named S. Maddox, wanted for questioning in the burning of a settlement in Kansas. The face in the sketch was younger, the beard fuller, but the eyes were the same, cold, dead. The scars on Jonah's chest, hidden beneath his shirt, seemed to sear against his skin. The fire, the screaming, the smell of burning hair. It rushed back with a physical intensity that made him grip the edge of a table to steady himself. This was him. This was the man who had ordered the torches thrown. Tom Avery, the boy from the livery stable, walked up beside him, holding a mug of cider. He saw what Jonah was looking at. "He keeps that there as a trophy," Tom said softly. "Most men would hide a past like that. Maddox framed it. He wants people to know what he was. What he is. He is here then," Jonah said. His voice was a rasp. Tom nodded. "Up at the big house, about 5 miles north. He rarely comes down." He sends Blake or the others. But when he speaks, the whole valley jumps. He is the king here. Mr. Cole. And kings do not like it when strangers stare at their history. Jonah turned away from the wall. I am not staring. Tom, I am memorizing. The prejudice that ran through Lantern Creek like a vein of black ore was exposed the following Sunday. The church was a small, whitewashed building with a steeple that listed slightly to the left, as if tired of pointing toward heaven. The bell rang with a flat, discordant clang that echoed off the canyon walls. Jonah did not usually attend service. God, and he had stopped speaking around the time his family burned. But that morning, he saw Elena and Mateo walking down the street, dressed in their best clothes. Elena wore a gray dress, high-collared and severe, her hair pinned back tight. Mateo wore a clean shirt that was too big for him, the cuffs rolled up. They walked with their heads high. But Jonah saw the way the townspeople parted around them like water around a stone. He saw the sidelong glances, the whispers behind gloved hands. He saw the isolation, impulsively. Jonah dusted off his hat and followed. Inside, the church was stiflingly hot. The air smelled of hymnals and starch. The pews were filled with the respectable folk of Lantern Creek, merchants, ranch owners, wives in bonnets. Elena and Mateo sat in the very last pew, isolated in a sea of empty space. No one sat within 3 rows of them. The whispers were audible, singing in that saloon every night, bringing strange men into her mother's house. Boy is wild, just like his father was. Jonah walked down the center aisle. His boots were loud on the pine floorboards. Every head turned. He ignored the stares of the deacon, the frown of the banker, the curious looks of the women. He walked straight to the back pew and sat down right beside Elena. She stiffened, her shoulder brushing his arm. She looked at him, her eyes wide with shock. A flush rose from her neck to her cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and a fierce, stubborn pride. You do not have to be here, she whispered, looking straight ahead at the altar. I know, Jonah whispered back. The service droned on. The preacher, a thin man with a voice like dried leaves, spoke of sin and redemption, his eyes darting frequently to the back pew. He spoke of the unclean and the dangers of moral decay. It was a sermon weaponized against the woman sitting beside Jonah, and everyone in the room knew it. Jonah felt the anger radiating off Mateo. He felt the rigid tension in Elena's posture. He simply sat there, a dark, immovable object, his presence a silent rebuke to the town's hypocrisy. When the service ended, the congregation filed out. The sunlight outside was blinding after the dim interior. On the steps, a group of women were gathering. When Elena tried to pass, one of them, the banker's wife, a woman with a face pinched by judgment, pulled her young daughter back sharply, as if Elena carried a plague. Stay close. Sarah, the woman said loud enough for everyone to hear. We do not want you catching the kind of violence that follows sin. Elena stopped. She stood very still, her hands gripping her reticule. Mrs. Higgins, Elena said, her voice shaking but clear. I am just trying to walk home. The woman sniffed. Then walk, and take your trouble with you. Another woman, emboldened, spat on the ground inches from Elena's boots. Jonah moved before he thought. He stepped between Elena and the women, his shadow falling over them. He didn't touch his hat. He didn't smile. He looked at the woman who had spat with a gaze so cold it could have frozen whiskey. That is enough, Jonah said. His voice was low, a growl in his throat. You call yourselves Christians. You act like buzzards circling a kill. The banker's wife gasped, clutching her shawl. How dare you? You are nothing but a drifter. And you are a bully in a bonnet, Jonah said. Step aside. The women shrank back, intimidated by his size and the raw menace in his tone. The path cleared. Elena did not look at them. She walked down the steps, her back straight as a rod. Jonah followed. When they were a block away, out of earshot, she spun on him. I did not ask for your help, she snapped. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I know, Jonah said. I can handle them. I have handled them for 5 years. You shouldn't have to, Jonah said. I do not need a champion. Jonah Cole, I need to survive in this town long after you are gone. You making enemies of the banker's wife does not help me put food on the table. Jonah looked at her, seeing the fear beneath the anger. She was right. He was a temporary force. She was the one who had to live in the wreckage. I'm sorry, he said, but I will not watch them spit on you. Elena looked at him, the fight draining out of her. She looked tired. Thank you, she whispered, the words costing her something. But please, be careful. That night, the sky turned a bruised purple and the wind changed direction. It stopped coming from the mountains and started blowing from the desert, hot and dry, a dust storm. It hit Lantern Creek like a physical blow. The wind howled around the boarding house, a shrieking demon that rattled the window panes in their frames. The air inside the house turned hazy within minutes as fine sand forced its way through cracks in the walls and floorboards. Jonah and Elena worked in a frenzy. Get the blankets, Jonah shouted over the roar of the wind. They nailed wool blankets over the windows, the hammer blows lost in the noise of the storm. The sand hissed against the glass like buckshot. In the kitchen, they shoved rags under the door. The space was cramped. As they worked to seal the back door, Jonah and Elena were pressed together. The lamp flickered wildly in the draft, casting frantic shadows. Jonah reached for a nail, his hand brushing hers. Their shoulders bumped. He could smell the dust on her skin, mixed with the scent of lavender soap. The storm outside pressed in, turning the small house into a capsule of intimacy in a chaotic world. Where is Mateo? Jonah asked, shouting to be heard. He went to the rail yard for an extra shift, Elena said, her eyes widening in sudden terror. He should have been back an hour ago. The rail yard? In this? He is out there, Elena gasped. She grabbed her shawl, moving toward the door. I have to find him. You cannot go out there, Jonah said, grabbing her arm. You will get lost in 10 feet. I cannot leave him, she cried, struggling against his grip. He is just a boy. Jonah looked at her face, pale with panic. He tightened his grip for a second, then let go. We go together, he said. Stay on my hip. Do not let go of my coat. They opened the door and the storm swallowed them. It was a world of violence. The wind stole the breath from their lungs. The dust was a blinding, stinging curtain that erased the town. There was no sky, no ground, only a screaming brown void. Jonah wrapped one arm around Elena, shielding her face with his body. He squinted his eyes to slits, navigating by memory and the feel of the ground. He knew the rail line lay to the north. He listened for the hum of the telegraph wires, the only sound that might cut through the wind. They stumbled forward, the sand scouring their skin. Elena clung to his coat, her fingers digging into the canvas. Mateo, Jonah roared. His voice was torn away instantly. They pushed on. Step by agonizing step, Jonah felt the vibration of the tracks through the soles of his boots before he saw them. He turned left, moving toward the sheds. They found him huddled in the lee of a water tower, curled into a ball. His coat pulled over his head. He was half buried in a drift of sand. Mateo, Elena screamed, falling to her knees beside him. The boy looked up, his eyes red and streaming, his face caked in gray mud. He was disoriented, coughing violently. Jonah didn't waste time. He hauled Mateo up, threw the boy's arm over his shoulder, and grabbed Elena with his other hand. Back, Jonah yelled. Move! The return trip was a nightmare of endurance. Jonah used his body as a plow, breaking the wind for them. He navigated by the slope of the land, by the faint shapes of buildings looming out of the dust like sea monsters. When his boot hit the wooden step of the boarding house porch, his knees nearly buckled with relief. They tumbled inside, slamming the door against the howling night. The silence of the house was deafening. The air was still hazy, but the wind was outside. They stood in the kitchen, gasping for air, covered in a layer of fine gray powder. Mateo collapsed into a chair, coughing up dust. Elena rushed to him, grabbing a wet cloth from the basin. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she wiped the grime from his face, checking his eyes, his breathing. You are okay, she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are okay." Jonah stood by the door, watching them. He felt the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving his limbs heavy. He watched the tenderness in Elena's hands. After a moment, Matteo nodded, exhausted. "I am okay, Elena. I got turned around." "Go to bed," she said gently. "I will bring you water." Matteo stumbled up the stairs. Elena stayed in the kitchen. She leaned against the table, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking. Jonah moved toward her. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Elena," he said softly. She turned to him. In the dim glow of the single lamp, she looked raw, stripped of all her defenses. Her hair was wild, full of dust. Her face was streaked where tears had cut through the grime. She looked up at him, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed down to the two of them. Jonah felt the heat of her skin through her dress. He saw the pulse fluttering in her throat. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and he felt a pull so strong it frightened him. It was a desire to protect, to hold, to kiss the dust from her lips. Elena's breath hitched. She leaned toward him, just an inch, her eyes searching his. The air between them crackled, charged with the energy of the storm and the survival. Then she blinked. The memory of the town, the church, the danger, rushed back into her eyes. She pulled away, stepping back sharply. A flush rose on her cheeks. "Darker than the dust. Thank you," she said, her voice brittle, "for finding him." "I would not have left him," Jonah said, his hand falling to his side. "I know," she said. She wrapped her arms around herself, rebuilding her walls. "But I do not need saving, Jonah, and I do not need you to look at me like that." "Like what? Like I am something precious," she said, her voice breaking. "Because I am not here." She turned and fled the room, leaving Jonah standing alone in the kitchen, the taste of dust and longing heavy in his mouth. The storm passed, but the tension remained. The next afternoon, the air was still yellow and still. Jonah was returning from the livery when he heard a voice in the alley behind the saloon. It was Blake. Jonah stopped. He moved silently to the corner of the building. Elena stood against the wall of the saloon, a basket of laundry at her feet. Blake had her boxed in, one hand resting on the wall beside her head. "You have been avoiding me, little bird," Blake said. His voice was oily. "I have been busy," Elena said, staring straight ahead. "Busy with that drifter?" Blake sneered. "You think he scares me? You think he can stop what is coming? I do not know what you mean. You owe us. Elena, you owe Mr. Maddox. He protected you when your daddy died and left you with nothing but debts. Who kept the bank from taking the roof over your head?" Elena's face twisted with revulsion. "He did not do it for charity. Blake, he did it because he wanted something, and I said no." Blake leaned closer. "You can only say no for so long. The interest is due, and Mr. Maddox is losing patience. He can destroy you just as easy as he saved you. Maybe easier." Jonah stepped into the alley. He did not speak this time. He just racked the hammer of his revolver. The sound, click-clack, was louder than a cannon shot in the narrow space. Blake spun around, his hand going to his gun, but Jonah was already there, the barrel of his Colt leveled at Blake's chest. "You have a bad habit of cornering women in dark places?" "Blake," Jonah said. Blake froze. His eyes darted between Jonah's face and the gun. "You are making a mistake. Cole, the mistake is yours." Jonah said, "Step away from her." Blake stepped back, his hands raised slowly. "You are a dead man walking. You know that? I have been dead a long time," Jonah said. "Now get—" Blake glared at Elena, then at Jonah. He backed out of the alley, turning only when he reached the street to disappear into the crowd. Elena let out a long, shaky breath. She picked up her laundry basket. She didn't look at Jonah. "I told you," she said, her voice dull. "I can handle it. He threatened you," Jonah said. "He is always threatening me. That is the air I breathe." She walked past him, her head down. Later that day, Jonah found himself in the sheriff's office. Elias Ward sat behind his desk, surrounded by maps of the territory and old wanted posters. He looked like a man trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Ward didn't look up when Jonah entered. "I heard about the alley," Ward said. "Word travels fast." Jonah said, "In this town? Bad news travels faster than light." Ward stood up and walked to a map on the wall. He pointed to a large section outlined in red ink. "This is Maddox's land," Ward said. "And this little speck is us. He surrounds us. He chokes us. So cut the throat," Jonah said. Ward turned, his eyes flashing. "It is not that simple." "You think I do not want to? You think I like watching him bleed this town dry? But if I move against him without proof, without the territory's backing, he will burn this town to the ground, and he will have the legal right to do it. He is pushing her." Jonah said, "Blake, he is talking about debts." Ward sighed, rubbing his face. "Elena, she is in a hard spot. Her father borrowed money from Maddox years ago. When he died, Maddox held the note. He has been holding it over her head like an axe. He wants her," Jonah said. The realization was cold and sick. "He wants everything he can't have," Ward said. "And he hates being told no." Ward leaned on the desk, looking at Jonah. "You standing between his men and what they want. It will only end one way, son. They will kill you. And they might hurt her just to spite you." Jonah looked at the map. Some lines can't be watched in silence. "Sheriff," Ward slammed his hand on the desk. "You are stubborn as a mule. I am trying to protect this town. Every time you pull that gun, you strike a match in a powder magazine. Then maybe it needs to blow," Jonah said. He turned and walked out, leaving the sheriff staring at the red lines on the map. That evening, the air was cool and clear. Jonah sat on the porch, watching the stars. Elena came out a few minutes later. She didn't have her shawl. She sat on the swing, the chains creaking softly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "Why do you do it?" she asked finally. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Why do you fight for me? You do not know me." Jonah looked at his hands. "I know enough." Elena looked out at the street. "Maddox, he came to me. After my father died, he came to the house. He said the debt could be forgiven. He said I could be comfortable." Jonah's fists tightened on his knees. The leather of his gloves strained. "I told him to get out." Elena said, "I told him I would rather starve." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "That is why the town hates me. Not because I sing in a saloon, but because I said no to the king. The women, they think I am spoiled. They think I am ungrateful. They think, if I had just said yes, maybe Maddox would be kinder to their husbands. Maybe the bank wouldn't squeeze them so hard." She turned to look at Jonah. Her eyes were wet. "They blame me for his cruelty, because I wouldn't let him own me." Jonah felt a fury so white-hot it almost blinded him. It roared in his ears, a storm worse than the one that had buried the rail yard. He wanted to ride to the North Ranch. He wanted to burn it down, timber by timber. He wanted to drag Silas Maddox out and make him beg. But then he looked at Elena. He saw the tremble in her lip. He saw the bravery it took just to sit there and tell him this. He realized then that their pain was tangled together. Roots of the same poisonous tree. Maddox had burned his home. Maddox had tried to buy her soul. Jonah stood up. He walked over to the swing and knelt down. So he was eye level with her. He didn't touch her. He just held her gaze. "You are not ungrateful." "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are the only free thing in this whole damn valley." Elena looked at him, tears spilling over her lashes, and for the first time, she didn't look away. She didn't pull back. She let him see her fear and her hope, and Jonah knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he would burn the whole world down to keep her free. The heat on the outer range was not merely a temperature. It was a physical oppression. It pressed down on the shoulders of the men and the backs of the horses, a heavy, invisible blanket woven of dust and blinding light. Jonah Cole drove a sledgehammer onto the top of a cedar post, the impact vibrating up his arms to rattle his teeth. He wiped sweat from his eyes with a forearm that was caked in grime. Beside him, Tom Avery struggled to unspool a length of barbed wire, the metal thorns glinting maliciously in the sun. They were 5 miles out from Lantern Creek, on the boundary line of the Miller property. It was poor land, mostly scrub brush and hard-packed earth that yielded grass only grudgingly. But it was Miller's land, and he had paid for it with 30 years of sweat. "Hold it taut," Jonah said, his voice rough. Tom leaned back, putting his weight against the wire. "I got it." As Jonah lined up the staple, a low rumble began to vibrate through the soles of his boots. It was a sound he knew better than his own heartbeat. It was the sound of moving beef. He paused, the hammer hovering in the air. He looked north. A cloud of dust was rising against the jagged blue line of the mountains. It billowed up like smoke, thick and choking. Out of the haze emerged the dark, shifting shapes of cattle, hundreds of them. They were moving fast, pushed hard by riders who cracked whips and fired pistols into the air. "That is Maddox's herd," Tom said, his voice tightening. "What are they doing this far south?" "They ain't grazing," Jonah said. He dropped the hammer and walked to his horse, pulling his rifle from the scabbard. The herd was not drifting. It was being driven. The riders were cutting a straight line across the open range, ignoring the property markers. As Jonah watched, the lead steers crashed through a section of fence 1/2 mile up the ridge. The wood splintered with a sound like dry bone snapping. The cattle poured through the breach, a river of red and brown hide, trampling the meager patch of winter wheat Miller had managed to coax from the ground. They crushed the irrigation ditches, turning the precious water into a slurry of mud. Jonah mounted his roan. Tom scrambled onto his own mare. "They are running them right through the crops," Tom shouted over the din. Jonah spurred his horse, riding toward the flank of the herd. He saw the riders clearly now. They wore the distinct yellow dusters of the Maddox outfit. He recognized one of them, a man named Skinner, who had a face like a hatchet. Skinner saw them coming. He reined in his horse, grinning, and tipped his hat mockingly. "Lost. Boys," Skinner called out. "You are on Miller's land," Jonah shouted, the roan dancing beneath him. "You are destroying his crop." Skinner laughed. "Cows go where the cows go. Drifter, can't argue with nature. You cut the fence." Jonah said, "I saw it." Skinner's grin vanished. "Proof is a hard thing to come by out here. Besides, this land is too dry for farming. Mister, Maddox is just doing the soil a favor, turning it back to pasture." Jonah's grip on the rifle tightened. The injustice was so naked, so arrogant, it made the blood pound in his ears. He looked at the cattle trampling the livelihood of an old man who had never hurt a soul. "Turn them," Jonah said. "Turn them north, or I will start dropping steers." Skinner's hand drifted to his holster. "You shoot a Maddox steer, and you will hang for rustling. Sheriff won't have a choice." Tom rode up beside Jonah, his face pale but his jaw set. "There are 2 of us, Skinner, and I count 5 of you. But Jonah here shoots straighter than any man I ever saw." Skinner looked at Jonah's eyes. He saw the same cold, dead look that had made Blake back down in the alley. He spat on the ground. "Move out," Skinner yelled to his men. "Let the strays wander." The riders whistled and spurred their mounts, driving the main body of the herd toward the canyon, leaving a swath of destruction 100 yards wide. The wheat was gone. The fence was kindling. Jonah watched them go, the rifle heavy in his hand. He didn't fire. Killing a man over wheat was a line he wasn't ready to cross today. But the anger sat in his gut like swallowed poison. "We cannot fix this," Tom said quietly, looking at the ruined field. "Miller is done. This wasn't about grazing," Jonah said. "This was an eviction notice." They rode back toward town in a heavy silence. The sun began to dip, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and bruised purple. As they crested a rise 3 miles from town, Jonah pulled up short. Smoke. It wasn't the dust of a herd this time. It was a dark, oily column rising from the dry creek bed to the east. "That is the flats," Tom said. "That is where the migrants camp." Jonah kicked the roan into a gallop. They arrived 10 minutes later, but they were 20 minutes too late. The camp, a temporary settlement of canvas tents and wooden wagons used by Mexican and Chinese laborers who worked the seasonal rails, was a smoldering ruin. The air smelled of burnt canvas, scorched wood, and the sickening scent of roasted meat. Wagons had been overturned and torched. Bedding lay scattered in the dirt, torn apart. A crate of supplies had been smashed, flour and beans poured out into the sand and trampled. Jonah dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. He moved through the wreckage, his gun drawn, though there was no one left to fight. A woman sat on the ground near the remains of a wagon, rocking back and forth. She was holding a bundle of rags to her chest and keening a low, high-pitched sound of pure grief. A man with a bloody bandage around his head sat next to her, staring at nothing. Tom was checking the perimeter. "They are gone! Jonah! Tracks lead north, toward the ranch." Jonah holstered his gun and knelt beside the woman. She flinched, terrifyingly, raising her arm to shield her face. "I am not with them," Jonah said softly. "I am not with them." He looked around. There were perhaps 30 people in the camp. Most were injured. Bruises, cuts, burns. It was not a massacre, but it was a message. It was a brutal, calculated act of terror designed to say, "You are not welcome. You are not human." "We need to get them to town," Jonah said, standing up. "Get the wagons that can still roll." They loaded the injured into the 2 surviving wagons. Jonah lifted a Chinese elder who had been beaten so badly his eyes were swollen shut. The man weighed nothing, like a bird made of hollow bones. Jonah felt a crack in his own composure, a fissure in the wall he built to keep the world out. This was not war. This was cruelty for the sport of it. They reached Lantern Creek after dark. The arrival of the burnt and bleeding caravan caused a ripple of shock, but few people stepped forward to help. Doors closed. Curtains were drawn. The respectable citizens wanted nothing to do with the trouble that followed these people. Elena met them at the edge of town. She had seen the wagons coming. She didn't ask questions. She simply started barking orders at Mateo to fetch water and bandages. She stopped when she saw the woman from the wagon, who was now being helped down by Tom. "Isabella?" Elena breathed. The woman looked up, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Elena," she sobbed. Elena rushed to her, embracing the woman without caring about the filth or the blood. They burned it. Isabella wept. They came in the dark. They laughed while they did it. Jonah watched Elena hold the woman. He saw the fury in Elena's spine, the way her hands clutched Isabella's back. He saw her look up at him, over the woman's shoulder, and her eyes were not afraid. They were burning. Sheriff Ward arrived moments later. He looked at the wagons, at the injured men, at the weeping women. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his gray hair. "God help us," Ward muttered. "Who did this?" Ward asked. Taking out his notebook, Jonah stepped forward. "Who do you think?" "Tracks lead north. Same riders who cut Miller's fence." Ward looked at the survivors. "I need a statement. I need someone to say they saw a face, a name." The camp survivors looked at the ground. They looked at the sheriff's star, and they saw no safety in it. They knew that speaking a name meant death. No one spoke. "You see," Ward said, his voice pleading, "I cannot act on ghosts." "Jonah! They are not ghosts!" Jonah snapped, gesturing to the beaten old man. "That is flesh and blood. I need a witness. I am a witness to the aftermath," Jonah roared. "Is that not enough?" Ward closed his notebook. "It is enough for me to know. It is not enough for a judge in the Capitol who takes dinner with the Cattlemen's Association." Ward turned away. His shoulders slumped. "I will file a report. I will mark it as unidentified bandits." He walked away into the dark, a man carrying a badge that weighed 1,000 pounds. The saloon was quiet that night. The piano player had gone home early. Sensing the mood, the usual laughter and shouting were absent, replaced by a sullen, fearful murmur. Everyone knew what had happened on the flats. Everyone knew who had done it. And everyone was terrified that they might be next. Jonah sat at a corner table, a bottle of whiskey between him and Elena. The amber liquid caught the dim light of the lantern. Elena had spent hours cleaning wounds and finding sleeping space for the women and children in her boarding house parlor. She looked exhausted. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a smudge of dried blood on her cuff. Jonah poured a drink. His hand was steady, but the glass trembled when he set it down. "I'm going to ride out there," he said. His voice was flat. "Dead." Elena looked up from her hands. "What?" "Tonight," Jonah said. "I'm going to ride to the North Ranch. I'm going to call him out." "Jonah!" "No," Elena said. "I am done watching. Elena, I am done fixing fences while he burns people alive. I am going to put a bullet in him, or I'm going to die trying. But I will not sit here and drink whiskey while he laughs." He stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Elena reached across the table and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Sit down," she hissed. "I have business to finish." "You have a suicide pact with yourself," she said, her voice rising. "You ride out there alone, and you are dead before you clear the gate. He has 20 men. Jonah, 20! I only need one shot." "And what then?" Elena demanded. "You kill him, and his men burn the town in retaliation? You think killing Maddox stops the machine? Blake will take over, or Skinner, and they will take it out on Isabella, on Mateo, on me." Jonah looked at her. The rage in his eyes was terrifying. A wild, cornered thing. "So we do nothing?" he asked. "We let him win. We survive," Elena said. "Survival is not enough." Jonah slammed his hand on the table. The bottle jumped, heads turned, but quickly looked away. "You want to live like a dog? Kicking for scraps? You want to bow your head every time a rich man walks by? That is not living, Elena. That is just waiting to die." Elena stood up, facing him. Her eyes were flashing with tears and anger. "You think you are the only one who hates him? You think I do not want to see him rot? Then let me go." "No!" "Why?" Jonah asked. "Why do you care if I die? I am just a drifter. I am just another gun." "Because you are the only one who sees me," Elena cried out. The words hung in the air between them, vibrating like a plucked string. The silence that followed was absolute. Elena's chest heaved. The tears spilled over now, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "You think you are protecting me by dying?" she whispered. "You are not. You are leaving me alone again. And I am so tired of being alone in a town full of people." Jonah stared at her. The rage in his chest began to fracture, cracking under the weight of her confession. He looked at this woman, fierce, exhausted, beautiful, and he realized that the thought of leaving her, even to die, hurt more than the memory of the fire. He slowly sat back down. Elena sank into her chair, covering her face with her hands. "I am afraid," Jonah said. His voice was so soft she almost didn't hear it. She lowered her hands. "Of Maddox?" "No," he said. He looked at the scarred wood of the table. "I have been running on hate for 10 years. It is the fuel in the engine. If I let go of it, if I stop hunting him, I am afraid there is nothing left of me. I'm afraid I am just a hollow shell with a gun." Elena reached out. She took his hand, her fingers sliding between his, calloused skin against smooth. "You are not hollow," she said. "I see how you are with Mateo. I see how you helped Isabella. I see you. Jonah." She squeezed his hand. "And that terrifies me more than Maddox, because if you are real, then I have something to lose." Jonah looked at their joined hands. He looked up at her face, the distance they had kept, the wall of landlady and boarder, the wall of singer and drifter, crumbled into dust. Elena stood up slowly. She didn't let go of his hand. "Come with me," she said. They left the bottle on the table. They walked out the back door of the saloon, into the cool night air. The alley was dark, smelling of sage and damp earth. They walked to the boarding house in silence, but the air between them was charged, electric. On the porch, in the shadows away from the street lamp, they stopped. Elena turned to him. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and traced the line of the scar on his jaw. Her touch was a feather-light ghost. "You do not have to be a monster to fight a monster," she whispered. Jonah closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. He felt the warmth of her body radiating in the cold night. "Elena," he breathed. He opened his eyes. She was looking at him with a hunger that matched his own, a raw, desperate need to find something soft in a world of iron. She stepped closer. Jonah brought his hands up to cup her face. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks. He lowered his head. The kiss was slow at first. It was a question. Are we doing this? Is this real? Her lips were soft, tasting of salt and sorrow. Jonah kissed her with a terrifying gentleness, afraid he might break her. Then Elena made a small sound in her throat and gripped the lapels of his coat, pulling him closer. The caution shattered. The kiss turned fierce, urgent. It was the collision of two lonely stars. Jonah wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Elena's hands tangled in his hair, pulling him down. They clung to each other like people starving, devouring the contact, trying to erase the memory of the burning camp and the dying cattle with the proof of their own life. It was not a kiss of romance novels. It was a kiss of survival. It was a declaration that they were here, they were alive, and they belonged to each other. The sun came up like a thief, stealing the night away in shades of gray and pale pink. In Elena's narrow room on the second floor, the light filtered through the lace curtains. Jonah sat on the edge of the bed, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out. He was fully dressed, though his boots were off. Elena sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder, her legs curled under her skirt. They hadn't slept. They had spent the night in a hushed, sacred conversation. Jonah had told her about his sister, about the way she used to braid her hair. He told her about the smell of the smoke that night. He told her things he hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. Elena told him about her father, a man caught between two cultures who died thinking he was a failure. She told him about the first time she sang in public and how the fear had turned into power. They sat in the quiet intimacy of the morning, their hands loosely clasped. It was an intimacy deeper than skin. It was the stripping bare of souls. "I have to go," Jonah said quietly, "before the house wakes up." Elena tightened her grip on his hand for a second. "Then let go." "I know." He swung his legs off the bed and pulled on his boots. He stood up and looked down at her. She looked small in the morning light, but her eyes were clear. "I am not going anywhere." Jonah said, I am not leaving town." "I know," she said. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. It was a promise. Jonah opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The floorboard creaked betrayal under his foot. At the end of the hall, Mrs. Gable, a widow who rented the corner room, was coming out with her chamber pot. She stopped dead. She looked at Jonah coming out of Elena's room. She looked at the time. She looked at Jonah's unbuttoned collar. Her mouth formed a perfect O of scandalized delight. "Morning, ma'am," Jonah said grimly, and walked past her. By noon, the story had traveled from the mercantile to the livery to the church steps. It grew with every telling. By the time it reached the saloon, Jonah hadn't just been seen leaving her room. They were practically married in sin. The town, already on edge from the violence, needed a scapegoat. They couldn't be angry at Maddox. That was too dangerous. So they turned their anxiety on Elena. The church elders met and spoke loudly of fornication and the bad influence on the community. Men snickered as they passed the boarding house, making lewd gestures. Women crossed the street to avoid walking in Elena's shadow. The prejudice that had always been a low hum became a roar. Elena Vargas was no longer just the outsider. She was the fallen woman. She was the excuse they needed to feel righteous. Maddox, sitting in his ranch house 5 miles away, heard the news from Blake. He didn't laugh. He simply nodded. He saw the leverage. That afternoon, Blake rode into town. He didn't go to the saloon. He went to the boarding house. He pounded on the door. Elena answered, wiping flour from her hands. Jonah was in the yard chopping wood. He stopped the axe mid-swing and walked toward the porch. "What do you want?" "Blake?" Elena asked. "Just delivering a message," Blake said, grinning. He held out a piece of paper. Elena took it. Her hands shook as she read it. All the color drained from her face. This says the loan is called—" "That is right," Blake said. "Full repayment, principal and interest, due immediately. But the term is not up for another year," Elena said. Read the fine print, darlin'. Clause 4. The lender reserves the right to call the note if the borrower's character or financial stability is in question. Blake leaned against the doorframe. And let us be honest, your character is the talk of the town today. This is illegal, Jonah said, stepping onto the porch. It is business, Blake said, not looking at Jonah. You have got 24 hours. Elena, $500. Or the sheriff evicts you, and Mr. Maddox takes the deed. He tipped his hat. Pleasure doing business. Blake walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away, leaving Elena holding the paper like a death sentence. $500, she whispered. I do not have 50. She sank onto the porch swing, the paper fluttering to the floor. This house, it is all I have. It is how I feed Mateo. It is how I help Isabella. Jonah picked up the paper. He crumpled it in his fist. He is doing this to get to me, Jonah said, and to punish you for choosing me. Elena looked at the street. She saw the neighbors watching from their windows. She saw the judgment. She saw the end of her life. We leave, Jonah said. Elena looked up. What? We pack what we can carry. We take the horses. We grab Mateo. We ride out tonight. Run, Elena asked. There is nothing here but hate and fire. Elena, we go to California. Or Oregon. Somewhere he cannot reach. Elena stood up. She looked at the horizon. The temptation was sweet. To just leave. To ride away from the sneers, the debts, the fear. To be with Jonah under a sky that didn't belong to Silas Maddox. But then she looked through the window into the parlor. She saw Isabella sleeping on the sofa, her burned arm bandaged. She saw the other women from the camp huddled near the stove. She thought of Mateo, who had finally found a sense of pride in standing up for himself. If we run, Elena said slowly, what happens to them? They will find a way, Jonah said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, they won't. Elena said, Maddox will crush them. He will take this house and turn them out into the desert. Isabella will die. Mateo will be hounded until he breaks. She turned to Jonah. Her eyes were dry now, hard as flint. I cannot leave them. Jonah, I cannot buy my happiness with their suffering. Jonah looked at her. He wanted to argue. He wanted to throw her over his shoulder and carry her to safety. But he knew she was right, and he loved her for it. Then we stay, Jonah said. But the house, to hell with the house, Jonah said. If he wants a war, we give him a war. Not with guns. Not yet. He stepped closer to her. We expose him, Jonah said. We get the proof Ward is too scared to find. We find the witnesses. We make so much noise the territory governor has to listen. It is impossible, Elena whispered. It is desperate, Jonah corrected. But it is all we have. He took her hand. We stay, Elena said. She squeezed his hand, and for the first time the connection between them wasn't just about comfort or desire. It was an anchor. It was a pact. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around them, and they chose to plant their feet. They would fight, not for peace. Peace was a dream for other people. They would fight for justice, and they would fight for the stubborn, fragile hope that they might live to see it. The office of Sheriff Elias Ward smelled of stale tobacco smoke, gun oil, and the sour scent of old paper. It was late, well past midnight, and the town of Lantern Creek lay under a heavy, suffocating silence. The windows were covered with heavy canvas shades to prevent any light from leaking out into the street, turning the room into a cramped, conspiratorial box. Jonah Cole stood by the door, his shoulder pressed against the wood, listening for footsteps on the boardwalk. Elena Vargas sat in the sheriff's wooden chair, her posture rigid, while Ward paced the small floor. A man at war with his own history. On the desk lay a map of the territory and a stack of ledgers that Ward had pulled from a locked safe in the floorboards. I have turned a blind eye for too long, Ward said, his voice a low rasp. He stopped pacing and looked at Elena, his face gray in the flickering lamplight. You want to know how Maddox operates? It is not just guns. It is paper. It is deeds transferred in the middle of the night. It is bribes to the territorial assessors to undervalue land so he can buy it for pennies. He tapped a leather-bound book on the desk. I have watched him do it, Ward admitted. I have signed the papers witnessing the transfers. I told myself I was keeping the peace. If I refused, he would just bring in a replacement who would sign, and who would probably shoot a few people for good measure. So I signed. I took his coin for the orphan fund, and I signed. Jonah looked at the sheriff with a mixture of pity and disgust. You sold your badge an inch at a time. Elias, I know what I did, Ward snapped, though there was no heat in it. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm telling you that fighting him with bullets alone will not work. He has the law in his pocket because he bought it. Elena reached out and touched the map. She traced the red lines of Maddox's expansion. If he bought the law, then we have to sell a better story to the men above him, she said. Her voice was steady. The strategist taking over the singer. Maddox is arrogant. He thinks the territory governor does not care what happens in a Dust Bowl town like this. And he is right, unless we make them care. How? Jonah asked. By showing them he is a liability, Elena said. The railroad company wants stability. They want workers to lay track, not camps burned to the ground. The governor wants tax revenue, not a cattle baron who hides his profits in false ledgers. She looked up at Ward. We do not just charge him with murder. We charge him with theft. We show the railroad that Maddox is costing them money. We show the governor that Maddox is cheating the territory. Money speaks louder than blood to those men. It is a long shot, Ward muttered, rubbing his eyes. It is the only shot, Elena countered. But we need proof. We need sworn statements. From the migrants. From the ranchers, he squeezed out. From the shopkeepers, he extorts. Jonah shifted his weight. The migrants are terrified. They won't talk to a badge. They might talk to you, Elena said softly. And they might talk to me. We have to try. Jonah, we have to build a case so heavy that even a corrupt judge cannot throw it out. The next 3 days were a study in frustration and grit. Jonah and Tom Avery rode out to the fringes of the valley, where the survivors of the burned camp had scattered. They found families living in makeshift lean-tos in dry creek beds, shivering in the cold desert nights. The reception was hostile. When Jonah approached a group of railroad workers huddled around a fire, a large man with a scar across his nose spat on the ground near Jonah's boots. White law never helped us before. The man growled. You come here asking for names? Names go on lists. Men on lists disappear. I am not the law, Jonah said, keeping his hands away from his gun. I am a man who hates Silas Maddox as much as you do. Hate does not stop bullets, another worker said. No, Jonah agreed, but ink might, if enough of you speak, if enough of you say what he did. It was a slow, agonizing process. Jonah had to sit for hours, sharing his own water, listening to their anger, letting them see the scars on his own face that marked him as a survivor of violence. He didn't promise them safety. He wouldn't lie to them, but he promised them a chance to strike back. Slowly, the wall of fear began to crack. A father whose wagon had been burned agreed to make his mark on a statement. A railroad foreman, tired of seeing his crew beaten, agreed to testify about the wage theft. Tom Avery wrote it all down, his hand cramping as he transcribed the broken English and rough dialects into legal testimony. In town, Elena fought a different battle. She went to the women who had shunned her. She walked into the mercantile, head held high, and spoke to the owner, Mr. Henderson, who had been forced to sell his best grain to Maddox at a loss for 5 years. She spoke to the widow Mrs. Gable, whose son had been beaten by Blake for looking at a Maddox horse the wrong way. At first, the doors were slammed in her face, but Elena was relentless. She didn't plead. She reasoned. She stood on porches and spoke of dignity. She reminded them that their silence hadn't bought them safety, only a slower death. One afternoon, Mrs. Higgins, the banker's wife who had pulled her daughter away from Elena at church, opened her door. She looked at Elena with cold suspicion. Why should I help you, Mrs.? Higgins asked. You bring nothing but trouble. I'm not the one burning camps. Mrs. Higgins, Elena said quietly. And I am not the one holding the mortgage on your husband's bank. Maddox owns you just as much as he owns me. The difference is, I am willing to say it out loud, Mrs. Higgins stared at her for a long time. Then, without a word, she stepped back and opened the door wider. It was not friendship, it was not forgiveness, but it was respect. The town began to see Elena not as the fallen woman, but as the only one with a spine straight enough to stand in the wind, amid the growing tension, with the shadow of Maddox lengthening over the valley. Jonah and Elena stole moments of peace like thieves stealing bread. Late one night, after the saloon had closed and the patrons had stumbled home, Jonah stayed behind. Elena was wiping down the tables, her movement slow with exhaustion. The piano player had left, but the ghost of the music seemed to linger in the smoke-stained air. Jonah walked over to the piano. He pressed a single key. The note rang out, lonely and clear. Elena looked up. She smiled, a tired, genuine curving of her lips that made Jonah's chest ache. "You do not know how to play," she said. "I know how to listen." He answered. He walked over to her and took the rag from her hand. He set it on the table. Then he took her hand in his. "Dance with me," he said. "There is no music." "Jonah." "Make some up," he said. She laughed, a soft sound that banished the darkness for a second. She stepped into his arms. They moved slowly in the silence of the empty room, shuffling across the sawdust floor. Elena rested her cheek against his chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. Jonah rested his chin on the top of her head, smelling the lavender soap and the faint scent of rain that always seemed to cling to her. For a few minutes, there was no Maddox. There were no debts. There was just the warmth of two bodies holding each other up. "I'm scared. Jonah," she whispered into his coat. "I know," he said, his arms tightening around her. "I do not want to be a martyr. I just want to live. With you." "We will live," Jonah said. He believed it because he had to. 2 nights later, they met in the shadow of the livery barn. A storm was rolling in from the north, the sky flashing with distant lightning that illuminated the plains in stark, white bursts. Thunder rumbled like rocks tumbling down a canyon. Jonah had his horse saddled, ready to ride out to meet Tom. Elena stood by the stirrup, her hand gripping the leather fender. "Don't go near the main house," she warned. "Stick to the ridge. I know the ground." "Elena." Their disagreements were sharper now, honed by the pressure. Jonah wanted to ride straight at the throat of the beast. He wanted to force a confrontation. Elena was playing a chess game, moving pieces, building alliances. "You always want to kick the door down," she said, frustration edging her voice. "Sometimes you have to pick the lock, and sometimes—" "While you are picking the lock, the house burns down," Jonah shot back. He saw the hurt in her eyes and immediately regretted it. He swung down from the saddle and pulled her against him. The wind whipped her hair across his face. "I am sorry," he murmured against her neck. I am not made for waiting." "I know," she said, clutching his duster. "But promise me you will come back. Promise me you won't do anything stupid. I promise I will come back." He left the second part unanswered. He kissed her then, a desperate, crushing kiss, as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. It tasted of ozone and fear. They clung to each other, hands gripping hard, trying to merge into one being that could not be broken by bullets or fire. When he finally pulled away and mounted his horse, Elena felt cold, as if he had taken the heat of the world with him, while Jonah and Elena built their fragile resistance. Silas Maddox made his move. He didn't send gunmen to the sheriff's office. He came himself. Sheriff Ward looked up from his desk to see Maddox standing in the doorway. The cattle baron was a man of 60, with a beard trimmed close and eyes like polished flint. He wore a suit of fine broadcloth that cost more than Ward made in a year. "Elias," Maddox said, nodding pleasantly. "Silas," Ward replied, not standing up. Maddox walked into the room, looking at the maps on the wall with the air of a landlord inspecting a tenant's quarters. "I had a letter from the sanatorium in Denver today," Maddox said casually, "regarding your daughter. Clara, isn't it?" Ward's blood turned to ice. He sat very still. "What about her? It seems the costs of her treatment are rising." Consumption is a terrible thing, expensive to manage. The administrator mentioned that the monthly payments, the ones arriving from an anonymous benefactor, were delayed. Ward's hand drifted toward the drawer where he kept his gun, then stopped. He knew it was useless. Maddox turned to look at him. I told them not to worry. I told them the funds would continue, as long as the peace in Lantern Creek continues. You son of a bitch, Ward whispered. Now, Elias. Maddox clucked his tongue. That is no way to speak to the man keeping your child alive. You have a good thing here. You wear the badge. I run the town. We both get what we need. Maddox placed his hands on the desk and leaned in. The pleasant mask slipped, revealing the shark beneath. This drifter, Cole, and the Vargas woman. They are stirring up dust. I do not like dust. Elias, it ruins the view. They are gathering evidence, Ward said, trying to find his voice. Evidence implies a crime, Maddox said, and there are no crimes here, only business. You need to remind them of that. Or perhaps the payments to Denver stop, and poor Clara is turned out into the street. Maddox straightened up, brushing invisible lint from his cuff. You are a practical man. Sheriff, I trust you will do the practical thing. He walked out, leaving Ward sitting in the ruins of his conscience, realizing that the trap had snapped shut years ago. He just hadn't felt the teeth until now. The breakthrough came on a Thursday. Tom Avery, working a shift repairing a windmill on the outer edge of the Maddox property, spotted something. He saw Blake hide a leather satchel under the floorboards of an old potting shed near the main garden, a structure that was rarely used. Tom waited until dark. He slipped into the shed, pried up the board, and found the book. It was a ledger, but not the official one. This one detailed payments to the association for removal services. It listed bribes to judges. It listed the specific costs of burning the migrant camp, categorized under land clearing expenses. It was the smoking gun. Tom rode like the devil to find Jonah, who was waiting in the box canyon. I got it, Tom shouted, waving the book as he slid his horse down the shale slope. Jonah took the book. He flipped through the pages by the light of the moon. It was all there. Proof of murder. Proof of theft. We have to get this to the governor, Jonah said, but the sky opened up. The storm that had been threatening for days unleashed a deluge. The dry plains turned into a quagmire of sucking mud. The creeks flashed into raging rivers. Jonah and Tom fought their way back to town, drenched to the bone, their horses slipping and stumbling. They wrapped the ledger in oilskin and tucked it inside Jonah's coat. They were carrying the heart of Maddox's empire, and the weather itself seemed determined to stop them. They made it to the edge of town just before dawn, exhausted and mud-spattered. They stashed the ledger in a hollow beneath the floor of the church, the one place they hoped Maddox wouldn't look, and went to find Elena. But the circle had a leak. One of the migrants, a man named Pedro, who had signed a statement, was cornered by Blake in the rail yard. Blake didn't use a gun, he used a knife, and he used fear. He threatened Pedro's children. Pedro broke. He told Blake about the list. He told Blake that they were gathering papers. He told Blake that Elena was the one organizing the town. Blake rode to Maddox. Maddox didn't hesitate. The attack came at dusk. Elena was walking Mateo home from the rail yard. They were on the main street, just passing the general store. The street was relatively busy with people finishing their day. 4 riders swept in. They didn't hide their faces. Blake swung down from his saddle and grabbed Elena. She fought, swinging her basket, landing a solid blow to his ear. "Run, Mateo!" she screamed. Mateo didn't run. He threw himself at Blake, a 16-year-old boy against a grown killer. Blake laughed and backhanded him, knocking Mateo into the dirt. Before Mateo could scramble up, another rider, Skinner, jammed the muzzle of a Colt revolver against the boy's temple. "Move and I splatter him!" Skinner roared. Elena froze. The basket dropped from her hand, apples rolling into the dust. "Let him go," Elena said, her voice shaking. "Get on the horse," Blake said, grabbing her arm. "Or the boy dies right here." Elena looked at Mateo. She saw the terror in his eyes. She looked at the townsfolk frozen on the boardwalks. No one moved. No one reached for a weapon. "I will go," Elena said. "Just let him go." She allowed Blake to hoist her onto his horse. She didn't look back as they thundered out of town, heading for the foothills. Jonah was in the livery stable with Tom when he heard the scream. He knew that voice. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He vaulted onto his horse, not bothering with the saddle. Grabbing his rifle, he tore out of the stable, the roan's hooves striking sparks on the stones. He saw the dust cloud of the riders leaving town. "I will kill them," Jonah roared, a sound that was not human. He kicked the horse into a full gallop, but as he reached the end of the street, a line of men blocked his path. It was not Maddox's men. It was 5 deputies, men who worked for Ward, men who had been bought. "Halt!" one of them shouted, raising a shotgun. Jonah didn't halt. He raised his rifle. He was going to cut through them. He was going to ride over them. Sheriff Ward stepped out from the line. "Drop it! Jonah!" Ward yelled. "Get out of my way!" "Elias!" Jonah screamed. "They have her! If you fire, my men will cut you down!" Ward shouted. "There are 5 guns on you. You will be dead in a second, and she will still be gone." Jonah pulled the roan up so hard the horse reared, pawing the air. Jonah's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He looked at Ward, and for a moment, he considered shooting the sheriff. "Don't do it, son," Ward said, his voice cracking. "Drop the gun." Jonah looked at the deputies. They were nervous, fingers twitching on triggers. If he fired, he died. If he died, Elena was alone. With a scream of frustration that echoed off the buildings, Jonah threw the rifle into the dust. "Take him," Ward ordered. The deputies swarmed him. They dragged him from the horse. Jonah fought like a wild animal, landing punches that broke bone, but there were too many of them. They pistol-whipped him, the blow catching him behind the ear. The world spun into gray static. They dragged him, half-conscious, to the jailhouse and threw him into the single-iron cell. The door clanged shut with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. An hour passed. Jonah paced the small cell like a caged tiger. His head throbbed, blood trickling down his neck. He gripped the iron bars until his knuckles were white. Ward sat at his desk, staring at the floor. He had sent the deputies away. It was just the 2 of them. "You coward," Jonah rasped. His voice was raw. "You let them take her. I saved your life," Ward said dully. "They would have filled you with buckshot." "Jonah, she is with Maddox," Jonah said. "Do you know what he will do to her?" "I know," Ward whispered. "Then let me out. Give me a gun. I can't." "Why?" Jonah roared, shaking the bars. "Because of your pension? Because of your daughter?" Ward's head snapped up. He looked at Jonah, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, haunted light. "Because if you ride out there now, alone, you lose. And if you lose, this town dies." "I do not care about this town," Jonah shouted. "I do not care about your laws or your ledgers or your peace. Peace ain't what I am after. I want the man who burned my family, and I want the woman I love." The confession hung in the air. "The woman I love." Ward looked at Jonah. He saw the desperation. He saw the truth of it. And something in the old sheriff finally broke. The fear that had held him paralyzed for years, the fear for Clara, the fear of Maddox, snapped under the weight of his own shame. He stood up. He walked to the cell door. He looked through the bars at the prisoner. "I have failed," Ward said softly. "I have failed this town. I have failed the law. And I have failed you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring of keys. He held them in his hand, the metal clinking softly. "I have been holding on to a peace that is rotten to the core," Ward said. "It is not peace. It is just surrender with a different name." He looked Jonah in the eye. "Maddox has her at the main ranch," Ward said. "He will keep her there to draw you out. He wants you to come. I will not disappoint him," Jonah said. Ward gripped the keys tight. "If I open this door," Ward said, "I am a dead man. Maddox will stop the payments. Clara will die, and he will likely kill me for treason." Jonah looked at the sheriff. He saw the sacrifice being offered. It wasn't a hero's gesture. It was the resignation of a man who had run out of places to hide. "Open it," Jonah said, "and we finish this." Outside, the town of Lantern Creek lay in darkness. The streets were empty. People sat in their homes, doors bolted, lights dimmed. They had seen Elena taken. They had seen Jonah dragged to jail. They knew that evil had come to claim its due. Some men looked at their own guns hanging on the wall and looked away, ashamed. Some women wept softly, but no one moved. The silence of the town was a heavy, suffocating blanket of cowardice. Only in the alley behind the livery, a young boy wiped blood from his mouth and checked the cylinder of an old rusty revolver. And near the church, a ranch hand named Tom Avery dug a package out of the dirt. They were waiting to see if the law would stand up, or if it would stay on its knees. The iron key turned in the lock with a sound like a bone snapping. It was a heavy, rusty noise that echoed in the silence of the jailhouse, louder than the thunder that had begun to rumble in the distance. Sheriff Elias Ward stood on the other side of the bars. His hand, usually steady enough to roll a cigarette in a gale, was shaking so violently that the keys chattered against the lock plate. He didn't look like a lawman in that moment. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into the dark. The door swung open. Jonah Cole stood up from the cot. He didn't rush. He stepped out of the cell and stood toe-to-toe with the older man. The shadows in the room were long, cast by a single kerosene lamp that sputtered on the desk. "Low on oil. If I let you go," Ward said, his voice a dry whisper. "I cannot be sheriff here anymore. There's no coming back from this." Jonah looked at him. He saw the resignation in Ward's eyes, the acceptance of a fate that had been waiting for him for years. "I know," Jonah said. "This is a one-way road, son, for both of us." Jonah nodded. "It is the only road left." Ward swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He walked to the gun rack on the wall. He took down Jonah's gun belt, the leather worn and supple, and handed it to him. Then he reached for Jonah's hat, dusting the brim with a trembling thumb before passing it over. Jonah buckled the belt. The weight of the Colt on his hip felt like a part of his body returning. He settled the hat low over his eyes. Ward turned back to the rack. He pulled down a Winchester rifle and a box of shells. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he unpinned the tin star from his vest. He looked at it for a long moment, the metal tarnished, the point slightly bent, before he slipped it into his pocket. "I am ready," Ward said. They walked out into the night. The town of Lantern Creek was asleep, or pretending to be, but in the alleyway behind the livery, shadows moved. Tom Avery stepped out, leading 4 horses. Beside him was Mateo. The boy looked small next to the large animals, but his face was set in a mask of ferocious determination that made him look 10 years older. "You brought the boy?" Ward asked, his voice sharp. "I am going," Mateo said. He didn't shout, but the steel in his voice stopped Ward cold. "She is my sister." Ward looked at Jonah. Jonah nodded once. "He rides," Jonah said. They mounted up in silence. The leather creaked, and the horses blew soft breaths into the cooling air. They turned their backs on the town and rode north, toward the darkness of the foothills. The country between Lantern Creek and the Maddox Ranch was a broken, hostile landscape. It was a tangle of scrubland cut by dry ravines that twisted like scars across the earth. The ground was hard and uneven, forcing them to keep a slow, punishing pace. Patches of stubborn sagebrush clawed at the horses' legs, releasing a pungent, bitter scent that mixed with the smell of the coming rain. The wind had picked up, a sharp, cutting gale that swept down from the peaks, carrying the chill of the high snows. Overhead, the sky was a churning bruise of purple and black. Lightning flickered inside the clouds, silent and ominous, illuminating the jagged profile of the mountains. In the flashes, Jonah saw vultures circling low in the distance, sensing the violence that was coming. Jonah rode alongside Mateo. The boy was white-knuckled on the reins, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if he could pull his sister closer by sheer will. He was vibrating with a mixture of terror and rage, a dangerous energy that could get him killed. Slow down, Jonas said, his voice low enough not to carry to the others. You will lame the horse before we get there. Let it go, lame, Matteo snapped, his voice cracking. They have her. Jonah, do you know what they are doing to her? Every second we waste riding slow. I know, Jonas said. You do not know. You are just a gun. You do not know what it is to have your family in a fire. The words hung between them, heavy and accusatory. Jonah pulled his roan closer, until his stirrup bumped Matteo's. I do know, Jonah said. The boy looked at him, startled by the flatness of the tone. I had a sister, Jonah said. Her name was Sarah. She was 2 years younger than you. Matteo's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jonah kept his eyes on the trail, watching the shadows. I was away when they came, just like you were at the rail yard. I saw the smoke from 5 miles out. I rode this horse until his lungs bled. I thought if I just rode fast enough, if I was just angry enough, I could stop it. He paused, the memory rising up like bile. I was faster than you. Matteo, I was a better rider, and I still arrived too late. All I found was ash. Matteo stared at him. The anger in the boy's face drained away, replaced by a dawning horror and a sudden, deep recognition. He saw the scars on Jonah's face not as marks of a tough man, but as the wreckage of a broken one. You are fighting him for her? Matteo asked softly. Or for them? Jonah looked at the boy. The wind whipped his duster around his legs. I am fighting him because I failed them, Jonah said, and I will be damned if I fail you too. Matteo nodded slowly. He loosened his death grip on the reins. The horse settled into a steady rhythm. The bond between them solidified in the dark. Not just allies, but 2 men carrying the same heavy stone, 5 miles to the north, inside the main house of the Maddox Ranch. The air was still and thick. Elena sat on a wooden chair in a small stone room that had once been a pantry. The door was heavy oak, locked from the outside. The only window was a narrow slit high in the wall, barred with iron. Through it, she could smell the ozone of the approaching storm. She was not crying. She had cried when they took her, out of shock, but the tears had dried miles ago, leaving behind a cold, crystalline clarity. She knew where she was. She knew who held the keys. The lock turned. Silas Maddox stepped into the room. He held a lantern in one hand and a glass of brandy in the other. He looked like a grandfather coming to tell a bedtime story, which made the menace radiating off him all the more suffocating. Comfortable, my dear? Maddox asked. Elena stared at him. She didn't speak. He set the lantern on a shelf and took a sip of the brandy. You look so much like your father. He was a stubborn man, too loyal, though he understood the way the world worked. He knew that some men are born to lead, and others are born to serve. He died in debt to you, Elena said. Her voice was steady. That is not service. That is slavery. Maddox chuckled. A dry sound like leaves scraping on stone. Debt is just a form of gratitude. Elena, I kept a roof over your head. I protected you. And how do you repay me? By stirring up the rabble, by bringing a killer into my valley. I did not bring him. Elena said, your cruelty brought him. Maddox's face hardened. He stepped closer, looming over her. The smell of expensive tobacco and brandy washed over her. You owe me, he said softly. You owe me obedience. You owe me silence. And tonight, you are going to learn to pay your debts. He reached out and touched her hair. Elena didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She looked him dead in the eye with a hatred so pure it felt like ice in her veins. I will not beg, she said. Maddox's hand paused. You can hurt me, she said. You can kill me, but I will never beg you, and I will never belong to you. Maddox stared at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, and for a second, he looked unsettled. He was used to fear. He was used to pleading. He didn't know what to do with dignity. We will see, Maddox sneered. He pulled his hand back. Your brother, he is a fragile thing, isn't he? It would be a shame if he had an accident at the rail yard. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face like stone. You are a small man. Silas, standing on a pile of money to make yourself look tall. Maddox's face turned red. He threw the brandy contents into her face. The alcohol stung her eyes, but she didn't wipe it away. "Rot in here," he spat. "When Cole comes, and he will come, I will let you watch him die. Then we will talk about gratitude." He slammed the door. The key turned. Elena let out a breath she had been holding for 5 minutes. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She moved to the door, listening to his footsteps fade. Then she moved to the window. She had work to do. She climbed onto a crate and peered through the bars. She watched the yard. She counted the seconds between the patrol passing. 1, 2, 3, 20 seconds. She noted the position of the barn. She saw the bunkhouse lights. She memorized the layout of the shadows. She would not be a damsel waiting for a hero. If Jonah came, she would be ready. The storm broke as the rescue party reached the ridge overlooking the ranch. It began with a crash of thunder that shook the ground, followed instantly by a curtain of rain that turned the world into a gray blur. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a minute. Jonah, Ward, Tom, and Mateo lay on their bellies in the wet sagebrush, looking down at the compound. Below, the ranch was a fortress of light and shadow. Lanterns swung in the wind as men moved along patrol paths. The main house stood on a rise, a 2-story structure of timber and stone, arrogant and solid. Ward used a stick to draw in the mud between them. The water filled the lines as fast as he made them. "There are guards at the gate," Ward said, shouting over the wind. 2 more on the porch, roving patrols by the bunkhouse. "Where is she?" Jonah asked, wiping rain from his eyes. "Stone room, north side," Ward said. "It is the only room with bars. He keeps the silver there usually. Now he keeps her." Jonah nodded. He checked the action of his rifle, shielding it with his body. "We cannot just ride in," Tom said. "They will cut us to pieces before we clear the fence." "We need a distraction," Ward said. He pointed to the main corral, a massive enclosure holding 50 of Maddox's best horses. "If those horses get loose," Ward said, "every hand on the ranch will be trying to catch them. Maddox prizes his stock more than his men." "I will do it," Mateo said. Jonah looked at the boy. "It is dangerous. Mateo, you will be right in the middle of them." "I am fast," Mateo said, "and I know horses. I can spook them." Ward looked at the boy, then nodded. "Go. Give us 5 minutes to get into position. When you hear the first shot, you cut the gate rope and fire your gun in the air." Mateo slipped away into the darkness, moving like a shadow among the rocks. "Tom," Ward said, "you take the high ground on the windmill. You cover us. If anyone steps out that back door, you drop them." Tom nodded, his face pale but set. He crawled away toward the east. "That leaves the house," Jonah said. Ward looked at the main house. The windows glowed with warm, yellow light. "You and me," Ward said. "We go in the front while they are watching the back." They moved down the slope, sliding in the mud. The rain was a torrent now, soaking through their coats, chilling their skin. But Jonah felt no cold. He felt only a burning, singular focus. They reached the edge of the porch. A guard was leaning against a pillar, trying to light a cigarette in the wind. Jonah moved. He didn't use his gun. He stepped up out of the darkness, clamped a hand over the man's mouth, and drove the butt of his knife into the man's temple. The guard crumpled without a sound. Jonah dragged him into the shadows. Suddenly, a gunshot cracked from the direction of the corrals. Then chaos. Mateo screamed, a wild, piercing yell. The corral gate swung open. 50 terrified horses, spooked by the storm and the boy, stampeded into the yard. They thundered past the bunkhouse, mud flying, whinnying in panic. Men poured out of the bunkhouse, shouting, grabbing ropes. "The horses! Get the horses!" In the confusion, Jonah and Ward kicked open the front door of the main house. They swept inside, boots skidding on the polished wood floor. A man appeared at the top of the stairs, fumbling with his suspenders. Ward fired from the hip. The man went down, clutching his leg. "North room!" Ward shouted. "Go!" Jonah ran down the hallway. He encountered another guard coming out of the kitchen. The man raised a pistol, but Jonah slammed his shoulder into him, driving him back against the wall. They grappled, the guard's gun going off and putting a hole in the ceiling. Jonah brought his knee up, hard, and then struck the man across the jaw with the barrel of his Colt. The guard dropped. Jonah reached the heavy oak door. It was locked. "Elena," he shouted, "stand back." He raised his boot and kicked the lock plate. The wood splintered, but held. He kicked again, putting every ounce of his rage into the blow. The door crashed open. Elena was standing in the center of the room, holding a heavy iron candlestick she had ripped from the wall. She looked ready to kill the first person who entered. When she saw Jonah, the candlestick clattered to the floor. "Jonah!" He crossed the room in 2 strides. She threw herself into his arms, colliding with him hard enough to knock the wind out of him. She was shaking violently. Jonah wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her and the stale air of the cell. "I got you," he whispered. "I got you." She pulled back, her hands framing his face. Her eyes were wet, but fierce. "You came. You crazy fool. You came. I told you," he said. He kissed her then, a rough, hurried collision of mouths. It wasn't gentle. It was a seal on a contract written in blood. It tasted of rain and terror and relief. Then Jonah pulled away. "We are not out yet. Can you run? Try and stop me," she said. They ran back into the hallway. Ward was waiting by the front door, firing his rifle through the window. "They are rallying," Ward shouted. "Maddox is organizing them." Glass shattered as a bullet punched through the window, showering them in shards. "Out the back," Ward yelled. "Tom is covering the yard." They bolted through the kitchen and out the back door. The courtyard was a nightmare of rain and mud. The horses were still running loose, creating a shifting maze of obstacles. Muzzle flashes tore through the darkness from the bunkhouse and the barn. Bullets slapped into the mud around their feet with wet thuds. Tom's rifle cracked from the windmill, dropping a man who was aiming at Elena. "Keep moving," Jonah shouted, firing his Colt at a shape in the barn door. They were halfway across the yard when a figure stepped out from behind a water trough. It was Skinner. He raised a shotgun. Ward saw him. Ward didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of Elena and Jonah, raising his own rifle. Skinner fired. Both barrels. The blast caught Ward in the chest. The force of it lifted the sheriff off his feet and threw him backward into the mud. "No!" Elena screamed. Ward hit the ground, but he didn't stop moving. He propped himself up on one elbow, blood pouring from his vest, and leveled his rifle. He fired. Skinner dropped. A hole in his chest. "Go!" Ward rasped, coughing blood. "Get to the horses!" Jonah grabbed Elena's arm, dragging her toward the gate where Mateo was waiting with the mounts. But then a voice cut through the storm. "Leaving so soon." "Cole?" Jonah stopped. He turned. Silas Maddox stood on the porch of the main house. He was unhurt. He held a silver-plated revolver in his hand. He looked calm, almost bored, amidst the carnage. Jonah pushed Elena toward Mateo. "Go," he said. "Jonah, no!" Elena cried. "Go!" Jonah turned back to face Maddox. The rain streamed down his face, washing away the mud and the sweat. He walked toward the porch. He didn't run. He walked with a heavy, inevitable tread of judgment. Maddox stepped down into the mud. He waved his men back. They lowered their guns, sensing that this was personal. "You burn my house!" Maddox shouted over the wind. "You steal my property. You kill my men. You are a pestilence." "Cole, I am the bill coming due," Jonah said. Maddox laughed. He spread his arms. "Look at you, standing in the mud. You are nothing, a drifter with a gun. I am the future of this territory. You are a murderer," Jonah said. "You burned a family in Kansas 10 years ago, a woman and 2 children. Maddox's smile faltered, then returned, crueler than before. "Ah, I remember. The squatter on the riverland. He wouldn't sell." "They were screaming," Jonah said, his voice trembling with the effort to hold back the beast inside him. "They always scream," Maddox said dismissively. "Fire does that. It cleanses." just like I am going to cleanse this valley of you." Jonah raised his gun. His finger tightened on the trigger. The rage was a white noise in his head. He wanted to shoot Maddox in the belly. He wanted to watch him bleed. He wanted to hear him scream the way Sarah had screamed. He was a fraction of a second away from murder. "Jonah!" The voice was sharp, clear, cutting through the rain. It was Elena. She hadn't left. She stood 10 yards away, mud on her dress, water plastering her hair to her face. "Don't do it!" she yelled. Jonah's eyes flickered to her. "If you execute him, you are him," she screamed. "Do not become a monster. Jonah, there will be nothing left for us." Jonah froze. He looked at Maddox. He saw the fear in the older man's eyes, not of death, but of the realization that Jonah was stronger. Jonah looked at Elena. He saw the future. He saw the valley with the thin stream. He saw a life that wasn't built on ash. He took a breath. He lowered the hammer of his Colt. He began to lower the gun. "You are right," Jonah said. "He is not worth it." Maddox saw the hesitation. He saw the gun drop. He saw his chance. With a snarl of desperation, Maddox raised his silver revolver. "I am the law here," Maddox screamed. In the split second that Maddox moved, Jonah's instincts, honed by a decade of survival, took over. It wasn't a decision. It was a reflex. Jonah brought his gun up. He fired once. The shot was a flat, hard crack that silenced the thunder. Maddox jerked backward as if kicked by a mule. The bullet caught him square in the chest. He dropped his gun. He looked down at the red stain spreading on his white shirt. He looked up at Jonah with an expression of profound disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood came out. Silas Maddox fell face forward into the mud of his own empire. The storm seemed to pause. The rain slackened. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Maddox's men stood frozen, looking at their fallen king. Then, one by one, they lowered their weapons. They were hired guns, paid to fight, not to die for a corpse. Jonah stood over Maddox for a moment. He felt no triumph. He felt only a vast, hollowing exhaustion. He turned and walked to where Ward lay. Elena was already there, kneeling in the mud, holding the sheriff's head in her lap. Ward's face was pale, his breathing ragged and wet. Jonah dropped to his knees. "Elias." Ward opened his eyes. He tried to smile, but it was a grimace. Did you get him?" Ward whispered. "He is dead," Jonah said. Ward nodded weakly. Good. He fumbled with his hand, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the tin star. It was slick with rain and blood. He held it out to Jonah. "Take it," Ward wheezed. "I am no lawman." "Elias," Jonah said, his throat tight. "Real law." Ward coughed. A terrible, rattling sound. "Real law ain't about the star, son. It is about standing up for people who will never thank you." He pressed the badge into Jonah's hand. His grip was surprisingly strong for a dying man. "I finally did one decent thing," Ward whispered. His eyes drifted to Elena. He looked at her with a profound sadness. "Tell Clara. Tell her I tried." "We will tell her," Elena said, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. "We will tell her that her father was a hero." Ward let out a long, shuddering breath. His gaze moved past them, up to the dark, storm-tossed sky. The tension left his body. His hand slipped from Jonah's grasp, leaving the badge in Jonah's palm. Sheriff Elias Ward lay dead in the mud, washed clean by the rain. Jonah closed his hand over the badge. He looked at Elena. She reached out and took his other hand. They knelt there in the wreckage of the night, battered, bleeding, and alive. Behind them, the clouds began to break. A single shaft of gray moonlight pierced the gloom, illuminating the valley below. The war was over. The peace, the hard, jagged peace of survivors, had just begun. The sun did not rise over Lantern Creek the morning after the gunfight. It merely bled into the sky, a pale, bruised gray that offered no warmth. The storm had washed the streets clean of dust, but it could not wash away the heavy, suffocating silence that hung over the town like a shroud. Jonah Cole rode down the main street at a walk. His roan horse was caked in mud, its head hanging low, Behind him, on a lead line, walked Sheriff Ward's horse, slung across the saddle, wrapped in a canvas tarp that was stiff with dried rain and blood, was the body of Elias Ward. People came out of their houses. They stood on the boardwalks, their hands tucked into aprons or pockets, watching the procession. There were no cheers. There was no jubilant celebration that the tyrant Silas Maddox was dead. There was only a wary, shifting unease. Maddox had been a monster. Yes, but he had been their monster. He had been the engine that kept the money moving, the bank open, and the cattle drives coming through. Now, with Maddox dead in the mud and the sheriff gone, the town felt unmoored, like a ship with its rudder sheared off. Jonah saw the faces as he passed. He saw relief in some. The shopkeeper who had been squeezed for protection money. The blacksmith who had been forced to shoe Maddox's horses for free. But he also saw anger. He saw the accusing glares of men who feared that the rail line would bypass them now, or that the territory would send soldiers to investigate the chaos. They looked at Jonah not as a liberator, but as the man who had kicked over the hive. Jonah rode straight to the undertaker's parlor. He slid from his saddle, his legs numb and heavy. He untied the ropes holding Ward's body. "Treat him with respect," Jonah told the undertaker. A thin man with watery eyes. He was the only good man you had. The funeral took place 2 days later. It was a stark, hollow affair. The graveyard sat on a rise behind the church, a patch of rocky earth where the wind never stopped blowing. The sky was a hard, unyielding blue, clear and cold as glass. The crowd was small. Tom Avery stood by the grave, his hat in his hands, looking 10 years older than he had a week ago. Mateo stood beside him, a bandage around his head, his face set in a grim line. Elena stood next to Jonah, wearing her black church dress, the wind whipping the hem around her boots. Behind them stood Isabella and the survivors of the burned camp, a silent phalanx of the people Ward had died to save. But the town notables were absent. The banker, the merchant, the church elders. They stayed away. To honor Ward now was to admit they had failed him while he was alive. There was no preacher. The circuit rider wasn't due for another month. Jonah stepped forward. He looked down at the simple pine box. He remembered the weight of the tin star in his hand, the last rasping breath of a man who had finally found his courage. He was tired, Jonah said. His voice was rough, carrying over the wind. He carried a heavy load for a lot of years. He made mistakes, but in the end, he stood up. That is all a man can do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the star. He dropped it onto the coffin. It hit the wood with a dull thud. "Rest easy, Elias." Elena threw a handful of dirt into the grave. The sound of the soil hitting the wood was the loneliest sound Jonah had ever heard. The vacuum left by Maddox did not stay empty for long. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the government. 4 days after the funeral, a carriage arrived from the territorial capital. It carried 2 men in dark suits with soft hands and eyes that measured everything in columns of profit and loss. They were investigators sent by the governor, stirred into action not by the death of a sheriff, but by the ledger Tom Avery and Jonah had saved. They set up court in the dining room of the hotel. They called witnesses. They examined the books. Jonah and Elena sat before them, telling the story of the extortion, the burned camp, the stolen wages. They laid out the map of Maddox's crimes. The lead investigator, a man named Mr. Sterling, listened with a face that betrayed nothing. He took notes with a gold-nibbed pen. "It is clear," Sterling said on the 3rd day, wiping his spectacles, "that Mr. Maddox exceeded his authority. The ledger confirmed significant tax evasion and irregular property acquisitions. And the murders?" Elena asked, her voice sharp. "The camp he burned? The people he killed?" Sterling sighed, a sound of bureaucratic fatigue. "These are tragic events, Miss Vargas, but with Maddox dead and his foreman Skinner dead, there is no one left to prosecute. The territory's priority now is stabilization. We must ensure the cattle contracts are fulfilled and the bank remains solvent." Jonah stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "You mean you are going to sell his stolen land to the next rich man who walks in the door? We will auction the assets to cover the tax debt. Sterling corrected. It is the law, Mr. Cole. It is the same machine, Jonah said bitterly. You just changed the operator. He walked out, unable to breathe the air in the room. The result was exactly as Jonah predicted. Maddox's empire was dismantled, but not returned to the people he had stolen it from. The bank absorbed the deeds. The cattle were sold to a syndicate from Denver. A few deputies were fired for corruption, but they simply drifted to other towns. The system that had allowed a man like Maddox to rise remained intact, bruised but breathing. Yet, for Elena, the world had shifted. She walked down the street a week later, carrying a basket of supplies. She braced herself for the usual cold shoulders, the turning of backs. Instead, Mrs. Gable, the widow who had once looked at her with scandalized delight, stopped sweeping her porch. She looked at Elena. She didn't smile, but she nodded, a short, sharp dipping of her chin. Morning. Miss Vargas, Mrs. Gable said. Elena stopped, surprised. Morning. Mrs. Gable. It was not friendship. It was not an apology. But it was an acknowledgement. Elena was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the Mexican girl who sang in the saloon. She was the woman who had stood up when the men had hidden. Later that day, Mr. Henderson at the Mercantile added an extra bag of sugar to her order. On the house, he mumbled, not looking her in the eye. For the boy. The prejudice didn't vanish. It was too deep in the soil, like the roots of the sagebrush. There were still whispers. There were still women who crossed the street to avoid her. But the monolithic wall of hate had cracked. It was peeling away in thin, stubborn layers, revealing the human beings underneath. Jonah felt none of this thaw. For him, the town was a cage of ghosts. Every corner reminded him of the violence. The alley where he had faced Blake, the jail cell where Ward had handed him the keys, the mud of the street where he had almost become a murderer. He spent his days repairing the damage to the boarding house, hammering nails with a savage intensity, but his eyes were always on the horizon. He slept poorly, waking at the slightest sound, his hand reaching for a gun that wasn't there. He was a man who had defined himself by the hunt for 10 years. Now the hunt was over. The target was dead, and he was left with a silence he didn't know how to fill. One evening, he found Elena on the back porch. She was shelling peas into a metal bowl. The rhythmic ping, 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 the only sound in the twilight. Jonah leaned against the railing. He watched the sunset bleeding red over the western peaks. I have to go, he said. He didn't lead up to it. He just said it, flat and hard. Elena's hand stopped. She didn't look up. Go where? She asked. Away from here, Jonah said. This town, it smells like blood to me. Elena, I walk down the street and I see dead men. I see the sheriff. I see Maddox. You can't run from memory. Jonah, I am not running, he said. I do not fit here. Look at them. They are trying to go back to normal. They want to forget. I cannot forget. He turned to face her. I am not built for a quiet life. Elena, I have spent too long in the fire. If I stay, I will just burn you too. Elena set the bowl down. She stood up and wiped her hands on her apron. She walked over to him, her eyes dark and unreadable. You think you are doing me a favor? She asked. I think you deserve better than a scarred gunman who wakes up screaming, Jonah said. You deserve a man who can give you peace, who can walk into church without everyone gripping their Bibles tighter. Peace, Elena repeated. She let out a short, bitter laugh. She stepped closer, invading his space. You listen to me, Jonah Cole. I spent 5 years trying to be good. I spent 5 years trying to be invisible so this town would tolerate me, and it nearly killed me. She poked him in the chest, hard. I do not want a quiet, easy life. I do not want a man who smiles and tips his hat and looks the other way when the world gets ugly. I want a life that is real. Elena, he warned, his voice cracking. You say you are dangerous, she said. You say you are living on the edge of a cliff. Well, good, because that is the only place I can breathe. Her voice shook, the facade of strength slipping to reveal the terrifying vulnerability underneath. When you are here, she whispered, I feel safe. Not because you have a gun, but because you see me. You are the only one who has ever seen me. If you leave, if you ride out of here thinking you are saving me, I will never feel safe again. I will just be alone in a room full of people." Jonah looked at her. He saw the tears standing in her eyes. He saw the fierce, stubborn love that refused to be polite. He realized then that he had been arrogant. He had thought he was the protector, the martyr. But she was saving him just as much as he had saved her. "You are asking for a hard life." "Elena," he said hoarse. "I am asking for a life with you," she answered. "I do not care how rough it is, as long as it is ours." The wall he had built around his heart, the wall he thought was protecting her, shattered. Jonah reached out and pulled her to him. It wasn't gentle. It was a collision. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, holding her as if the earth were trying to buck them off. Elena clung to him, her fingers digging into his back. They breathed in the scent of each other, dust and soap and rain. They kissed, a desperate, hungry seal on their pact. It was a kiss that tasted of salt and promise. In that small, lamp-lit space, with the ghosts of the town watching from the shadows, they chose each other. Completely. It was an act of defiance against the whole brutal frontier. They would not be victims. They would not be alone. The next morning, the air was crisp, smelling of sage and new beginnings. Jonah spread a map out on the kitchen table. Elena and Mateo leaned over it. "We cannot stay in Lantern Creek," Jonah said. "You were right. Elena, the memories are too thick here, and the new owners of the Maddox land, they won't take kindly to the man who killed their predecessor living next door." He traced a line with his finger, moving west, into the deep, broken country of the territories. "I passed through a place once," Jonah said, "years ago, before I found the trail of Maddox. It is a high valley, remote, hard to get to." He tapped a blank spot on the map. "There is a creek," he said, "thin, but it runs all year. Sweet water. There is enough grass to run a small herd if you move them carefully. It is surrounded by rock. No neighbors for 50 miles. Mateo looked at the map, then at Jonah. "Is it safe?" "It is wild," Jonah said, "but it is empty. No one knows our names there. No one knows our sins." Elena looked at the spot. It was nothing but paper and ink, but in her mind, she saw it, a place where the wind blew clean. "We go," she said, "but on 2 conditions." Jonah looked at her. "Name them." "First, Mateo comes. He is not a child anymore, but he is my blood. We do not leave family behind. I wouldn't have it any other way," Jonah said, glancing at the boy. "We will need his back." "And second," Elena said, her voice firm, "if we build a home, we build it with a door that opens. If someone comes along, someone running, someone hurt, someone like Isabella, we do not turn them away. We do not become like this town." Jonah smiled. It was a small, crooked thing, but it reached his eyes. "A boarding house in the middle of nowhere?" he asked. "A sanctuary," she corrected. "Done," Jonah said. They spent the next 3 days packing. They sold the boarding house to Mrs. Gable, who paid a fair price and promised to keep the extra rooms for the camp survivors until they could move on. They bought a wagon, supplies, tools, and seeds. On the morning of their departure, Tom Avery stood by the lead horse. He wore a new vest, and on it, pinned carefully over his heart, was a new star. The town council had asked him to take it. He had accepted, reluctantly, but with a sense of duty that Ward would have recognized. "You sure I cannot convince you to stay?" Tom asked, scuffing his boot in the dirt. "I could use a deputy who shoots straight. My fighting days are done." "Tom," Jonah said, "at least, I hope they are." Tom nodded. He looked at Elena, then at Mateo, who was sitting proudly on the seat of the wagon holding the reins. "You take care of them." "Jonah." "You take care of the town," Jonah replied. "Do not let the suits from the capital sell it down the river." "I will try," Tom said. He reached out. Jonah took his hand. It was a firm grip, the handshake of men who had bled together. They pulled each other into a rough embrace, thumping each other on the back. "Be safe, brother," Tom whispered. "You too." Jonah mounted his roan. He looked at Elena, who sat beside Mateo on the wagon. She wore a sunbonnet and a travel coat, but her face was turned forward, toward the west. She didn't look back at the town that had scorned her. "Let's ride," Jonah said. The wagon lurched forward. The wheels creaked. They rolled down the main street of Lantern Creek, past the saloon, past the jail, past the church. They rode out into the open plains, the town shrinking behind them until it was just a smudge of gray against the vastness of the earth. The journey took 3 weeks. They traveled through a landscape that was hostile and magnificent. They crossed salt flats that cracked under the wheels. They climbed rocky switchbacks where the horses lathered and stumbled. They slept under skies so full of stars it felt like they were falling upward into them. It was not easy. They broke an axle and had to carve a new one from a piece of ironwood. They waited out a sandstorm, huddled under the wagon canvas, playing cards and telling stories while the wind screamed outside. But with every mile, the weight on Jonah's shoulders lightened. The ghosts of Lantern Creek, the ghost of Maddox, the ghost of his burning home. They didn't vanish, but they fell behind, unable to keep up with the pace of the living. Finally, they crested a ridge and looked down. The valley was just as Jonah remembered, perhaps even more rugged. It was a bowl of rock and scrub, framed by cliffs of red sandstone that glowed in the afternoon light. Stunted pine trees clung to the slopes like stubborn sentinels. But down the center, a ribbon of green marked the path of the creek. It was a thin, bright line of life in the desolation. Mateo whooped, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. "That is it," he yelled. "That is it," Jonah said. They guided the wagon down the slope, the brake blocks screeching. They stopped near the water, where the grass was knee-high and yellow. They climbed down. The silence was absolute. No train whistles, no saloon pianos, no shouting. Just the wind in the pines and the murmur of the water. Elena took off her bonnet. She turned in a slow circle, taking it in. It was harsh land. It would be cold in the winter and brutal in the summer. It would demand everything they had. "It is perfect," she said. They didn't waste time. Jonah took a heavy iron digging bar from the wagon. He walked to a spot near a grove of cottonwoods that would offer shade. He raised the bar and drove it into the earth. Clang. The sound was solid, real. Mateo grabbed a shovel. Elena began to mark out the corners of where the cabin would stand, dragging her heel in the dirt. "Here," she said. "The door faces east, to catch the morning sun. We will need to fell those pines for timber," Jonah said, pointing to the ridge. "And we will plant corn near the creek," Mateo added. "I saw wild onions growing there too." They talked of the future. They talked of crops, of fences, of maybe buying a few head of cattle in the spring. They talked of building a room for travelers, just as Elena had promised. It was a life stitched together from small acts of stubborn hope. As the day waned, the sun sank behind the western ridgeline. The valley was plunged into shadow, but the cliffs above them caught the last of the light, burning with a fierce, rust-colored gold. The work stopped. Jonah stood wiping his brow, leaning on the digging bar. Mateo had wandered down to the creek to water the horses, teasing them playfully. Elena walked over to Jonah. She stood beside him, looking at the foundation they had marked in the dirt. She reached out and laced her fingers through his. Her hand was rough from the work, her grip strong. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Jonah exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to empty his lungs of 10 years of smoke. He remembered the sheriff's warning, spoken on that first night in the street. "You'll never find peace out here, not with what you're carrying." A small, crooked smile touched Jonah's lips. Maybe the sheriff was right, he thought. The memories would always be there. The scars on his chest and his face would never fade. The world was still a brutal place, full of men like Maddox. Peace, that soft, quiet thing people prayed for, might never fully be his. But as he felt the warmth of Elena against his side and heard Mateo laughing by the water, Jonah understood at last. He wasn't after peace. He never had been. He was after this. He was after a love fierce enough to keep standing when the wind tried to blow you down. He was after a life that he chose, not one that was forced on him. He was after the rough, stubborn happiness of building something real in a world that wanted to grind you to dust. Jonah squeezed Elena's hand. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the dying light and the rising stars. "You okay?" she asked softly. Jonah looked at the valley. He looked at the woman who had saved him. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady and sure. "I am home. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and shadows of the American West, and I hope Jonah and Elena's fight for a life of their own resonated with you. I would love to hear your thoughts on the ending. Did they find the justice they deserved? Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from and what you thought of the story. If you enjoyed this tale of grit and romance, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. Until next time, keep riding.